Most people know the name and picture the uniform, the medals stacked across a chest that by 1943 belongs to a man consuming morphine tablets daily, shuffling stolen paintings between private estates, while the Air Force he built bleeds its best pilots faster than Germany can train replacements. But the version of Hermann Göring that history remembers most clearly is the final one. And starting there means missing the 20 years that explain how a decorated fighter ace with 22 confirmed aerial kills and command of the Richthofen wing ends up standing trial at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. Those two endpoints, the cockpit in 1918 and the defendant's dock in 1946, are connected by a chain of decisions, dependencies, and institutional overreach that is considerably more specific and documented than the cartoon villain version allows. The First World War produces Göring as a genuinely capable combat pilot at a time when military aviation kills its practitioners at rates that make infantry casualty figures look manageable by comparison. He survives, accumulates his kills, earns the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration, and finishes the war commanding the most celebrated fighter wing in the German air service. That credential is not decorative. It is the specific currency he spends for the next 15 years buying political access, institutional positions, and Hitler's personal trust. What the credential cannot survive is the gap between what it promises and what the Luftwaffe actually delivers when Göring stakes his reputation against operational reality. Dunkirk is the first fracture. He personally guarantees Hitler that the Luftwaffe can prevent the British evacuation without committing the panzers. Roughly 338,000 Allied soldiers crossed to England anyway across 9 days, while the Bf 109 burns through its 20 minutes of usable combat time over the beaches and turns for France. The Battle of Britain follows, with 2,600 German aircraft assigned to break RAF Fighter Command, and the decision Göring makes in early September 1940 to shift bombing from RAF airfields to London removes the systematic pressure from the infrastructure that was genuinely close to cracking, at exactly the wrong moment. The Luftwaffe loses roughly 1,700 aircraft between July and October. Sea Lion is cancelled. The promise fails. Then Stalingrad. 290,000 encircled German soldiers require a minimum of 500 tons of daily air supply to sustain combat operations. Göring tells Hitler the Luftwaffe can deliver it. The actual daily average in December 1942 reaches approximately 94 tons. In January, it drops towards 60. Roughly 490 transport aircraft are destroyed across the entire airlift. The Sixth Army surrenders February 2, 1943, and fewer than 6,000 of the roughly 90,000 men who march into Soviet captivity will ever return home. 3 promises, 3 failures measured in specific tonnage, specific aircraft losses, and specific body counts. What makes Göring's story genuinely worth examining in full is not the corruption or the drug dependency or the looted art collection filling the rooms of Karrenhall, though all of those are documented in extraordinary detail. It is the mechanism by which a man with real capability in one narrow domain accumulates authority across domains far beyond that competence, and the way an entire military institution absorbs the consequences of that mismatch across 6 years of war. By the time the Reichsmarschall sits in the Nuremberg dock in 1945, he is coherent, sharp, and conducting his own defense with an intelligence that surprises the prosecutors. The man who fractured 3 critical operations through overstatement and personal deterioration is also the man who nearly outmaneuvers the Allied legal team at his own war crimes trial. That combination, the capability and the catastrophe sitting inside the same person, is the reason this story takes the entire length of a man's life to tell properly. When I spent time working through the Luftwaffe personnel records and Göring's personal correspondence from the Battle of Britain period, the detail that stayed with me longest was not the strategic decisions, but the tone of his internal communications, the absolute certainty in his own assessments delivered to Hitler even as the operational data arriving on his desk told a different story. There is no hedging, no acknowledgement of the margin between the promise and the performance. Reading those documents, you understand something about how the Third Reich's command culture worked that no overview history fully captures. And if the quiet has settled around you now, and the details of this are beginning to layer themselves into something you want to follow properly, the fighter pilot, the political operator, the Luftwaffe architect, the man who made 3 promises that each cost Germany something it could not recover, and the defendant who walked into Nuremberg and nearly made the court work harder than it expected, all of that is ahead. This is the entire history of Hermann Göring, from fighter ace to Reichsmarschall during the Second World War. There is a castle in Franconia that most people have never heard of. It sits above the valley of the Pegnitz River, its stone walls going back to the 11th century, its towers catching the light in a way that makes it look, from the right angle, like something out of a fairy tale. The Weldenstein. And somewhere in the Bavarian State Archives, if you know what to look for, there is a carbon copy of a letter dated 1896, politely and warmly written, inviting a German colonial judge and his family to come and live there, as guests. The man writing the letter owned the castle. The man receiving it did not. He said yes immediately. We know this because someone, historians believe it may have been the judge's young son, then just 3 years old, though obviously writing much later, added a short note at the bottom of the copy. 4 words. Papa said yes immediately. That note, written in a heavier pen than the rest, is where this story begins. Not on a battlefield, not in a parliament, in a borrowed room, in someone else's castle, in the childhood of a boy who would spend the rest of his life trying to own the things he had only ever been lent. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born on the 12th of January, 1893, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. His father, Heinrich Ernst Göring, was a career colonial administrator, a judge and former cavalry officer who had served as the first Governor-General of German Southwest Africa, which is today Namibia. By the standards of the late German Empire, that was a distinguished career. By the standards of actual Prussian aristocracy, it was adjacent to distinction, close enough to smell it but not quite inside. The family had no independent wealth. They had a name, a record of service, and a very useful friendship with a man named Heinrich Ernst von Eppenstein. Eppenstein was a medical doctor by training, a man of considerable inherited wealth, and the official godfather to Hermann Göring. He was also, though this was aggressively suppressed in later years, of Jewish heritage, a baptized convert to Catholicism who had spent his life constructing an identity of German noble respectability around a foundation the Nazi state would later declare invalid. The arrangement that placed the Göring family inside Eppenstein's castles, first the Weldenstein, later the Burg Mautendorf in Salzburg province, was, to put it plainly, one of dependent tenancy dressed up as friendship. Heinrich Göring received accommodation, social standing by association, and the visual prestige of raising his children in medieval towers. What Eppenstein received is somewhat delicate to describe even now. He and Franziska Göring, Hermann's mother, maintained what multiple historians have gently characterized as a close personal relationship throughout the years of the family's residency. Hermann's sister Olga confirmed this in her post-war memoirs. The point isn't salacious, the point is structural. The boy who grew up in those rooms grew up watching his father accept a particular kind of social subordination, and watching his mother navigate a particular kind of dependency, and the household he was raised in was one in which dignity was performed rather than owned. That performance became his inheritance. What the Weldenstein actually gave him, practically speaking, was a very specific sense of what power looked like. Stone walls, hunting grounds, rooms full of objects, fireplaces large enough to stand in. The Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, where he would later build Karenhall, the great private estate that consumed hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks and 10,000 square meters of looted artworks, was a direct architectural echo of his godfather's properties. He wasn't imitating the aristocracy in the abstract. He was recreating the specific rooms he'd been allowed to occupy as a child but had never been permitted to own. That is an important distinction, and most biographies of Göring miss it entirely. He wasn't chasing an idea, he was chasing a deed. His formal education began at the gymnasium in Fürth and later at a boarding school in Ansbach, and the school reports that survive in Bavarian state records are worth pausing on. They describe a boy who was energetic, willful, academically capable when motivated, and specifically, resistant to correction. That last phrase appears more than once across different teachers' assessments. The German is something like korrekturresistent, not a word you'd use for a child who was simply stubborn. It implies a child who received criticism and reorganized it, almost automatically, into a form he could dismiss. The same quality would later allow him to sit in the dock at Nuremberg for 10 days of cross-examination and leave the prosecution looking disorganized. He learned it young. He learned it in those borrowed rooms. The application to the Prussian military cadet academies came in 1905, when Hermann was 12. Entry into the cadet system, the Kadettenschulen, required documented officer class or noble ancestry on both sides of the family, academic aptitude, and a medical examination. His father's career as a colonial official and former cavalry officer qualified the family for consideration, though just barely. The cadet system was not merely a military school, it was a social sorting mechanism. Boys who graduated from the Hauptkadettenanstalt at Berlin-Lichterfelde received automatic officer commissions in the Imperial German Army. They became, by institutional decree, members of the officer class. For the son of a dependent guest in a borrowed castle, this was not just an education, it was a transformation. He excelled there, not despite the rigid hierarchy of the cadet school system, but because of it. He understood something early that many people never understand. Systems built on visible, legible status can be climbed by anyone willing to perform that status convincingly enough. When he left the cadets in 1912 and received his commission as a lieutenant in Infantry Regiment 83, the Prince Karl Anton of Hohenzollern Regiment, he was 19 years old, slim, physically confident, and possessed of a social fluency that came from years of watching how rooms worked. He could talk to generals at dinner. He could manage the politics of a mess hall. He knew which fork to use and when to defer and when to be audacious, because he'd watched his father calibrate those decisions every day of his childhood. The military didn't teach him those skills. The borrowed castle did. And when, 2 years later, the Great War began and the world he'd been trained for turned into something no one had prepared for, that particular skill set, the performance of belonging, the management of status, the ability to make powerful men feel understood, would carry him further than his rifle ever did. I want to be honest about something before we move to the war. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to read Göring's childhood as a simple origin story for his later crimes. The Weldenstein didn't make him a war criminal. A borrowed castle doesn't cause the Holocaust. But it did produce a man with a very specific psychological architecture, one in which the gap between appearance and ownership was the central wound, and in which the acquisition of visible, concrete symbols of power became the lifelong project of closing that wound. The art, the uniform, the medals, the manufactured title, the baton. These weren't decorations, they were compensations. And understanding what they were compensating for is the only way to make sense of how a decorated fighter pilot and a founding member of the Gestapo ended up being the same person. Heinrich Ernst von Eppenstein died in 1934. By that point, his godson was one of the 3 most powerful men in Germany. The Nazi state's racial laws, which Göring himself had helped construct, would shortly classify Eppenstein's Jewish heritage as a formal mark of exclusion. 2 of Eppenstein's properties, the castle at Mauterndorf and the Weldenstein itself, were eventually transferred to Göring through mechanisms that post-war German courts would later describe as coerced acquisition. He went back for the deeds. He always intended to go back for the deeds. The boy who was told, "Papa said yes" immediately, eventually said yes himself, and signed his own name at the bottom, and didn't acknowledge, not once in any surviving document, that the man who had given him his childhood was the kind of man the laws he'd built were designed to erase. There is a word in German, Weltschmerz, that means, roughly, the pain caused by the gap between the world as it is and the world as one feels it should be. It's a romantic concept, usually applied to artists and philosophers. It doesn't often appear in biographies of military commanders or war criminals. But reading through the records of Göring's childhood, the school reports, the castle residency papers, the family correspondence, the word keeps coming to mind in an ugly, distorted form. He felt the world owed him something that it hadn't yet delivered. And when he found, in the structure of the Nazi movement, a system that would let him collect that debt at someone else's expense, he collected it without apparent hesitation. That is the story of the Weldenstein. That is where it starts. The Fabric of the Sky, Göring as Infantry and Observer, 1914 to 1915. The first thing you need to understand about the Western Front in the autumn of 1914 is that it was not the trench warfare of popular imagination. Not yet. In the Vosges Mountains of Alsace, where Infantry Regiment 112 was deployed in October and November of that year, the fighting was still mobile, still confused, conducted through dense forest at high altitude with no clear front line and very little intelligence about what lay beyond the next ridge. Lieutenant Hermann Göring arrived with this regiment, not as a celebrated ace or a man of destiny, but as one of roughly 40,000 junior officers being fed into a military machine that was consuming men faster than it could train them. His entry in the regiment's war diary, the Kriegstagebuch, which is now held in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, is not distinguished. He is listed, noted, given tasks, and that's it. There is no portent in those pages, no foreshadowing, just a name in a column like the others. What happened next, however, turned out to matter rather more than the diary entry suggests. In November of 1914, Göring fell ill with rheumatic fever of the left knee and was evacuated to a hospital at Mülheim. The illness itself was not remarkable. Rheumatic conditions were epidemic among troops in the Vosges, whose cold and damp climate was genuinely punishing. What was remarkable was that while he was recovering, he apparently began conversations with a fellow patient who was an officer in the German air service. We don't have a name for this man. We don't have a transcript of the conversation. What we have is the record of what Göring did next. He applied for transfer to aviation. The timing lines up. The connection, circumstantial but coherent, is almost certainly real. A sick knee on a wet mountain changed the course of the 20th century. That is the kind of thing that keeps archive researchers up at night. He didn't go directly to fighter aviation. This is the part most documentaries skip, and skipping it is a serious error. Göring's first posting in the air service was as a Beobachter, an aerial observer, attached to Feldflieger Abteilung 25 in early 1915. The observer role was the most dangerous job in German aviation in that year, and arguably in any year of the war. The observer rode in the rear seat of a two-seater reconnaissance aircraft, responsible for everything except flying the machine, photographing enemy positions using the Ryan Messbildkammer glassplate camera system, directing artillery fire via radio or visual signal, sketching troop dispositions, and, using a ring-mounted parabellum machine gun, defending the aircraft against enemy fighters that were specifically hunting two-seaters. The aircraft he flew in, the Albatros B-2, had a maximum service ceiling of roughly 2,800 meters, a top speed of approximately 100 kilometers per hour, and absolutely no ballistic protection for its crew. The engine, a 150 horsepower Benz BZ-3, had a known tendency to overheat on extended sorties. In 1914 and 15, records indicate that engine failure killed more observer crew than enemy action did. The work of an aerial observer in 1915 required a specific type of intelligence that had nothing to do with flying. It required spatial memory, the ability to look at the ground from altitude and translate what you saw into militarily actionable information. You needed to know what an artillery battery looked like from 3,000 meters, what a concealed ammunition dump looked like in woodland, what a river crossing under construction looked like in the half-light of early morning. Göring filed an after-action report in the spring of 1915. The document is referenced in the unit records, though its full text has not been published, noting that on a single sortie over the Champagne sector, he had identified 3 French artillery positions that had not appeared on any existing divisional map. Whether that specific claim is fully verifiable against French records from the same period, I honestly can't confirm. But the report exists, the claim was made, and the unit recognized the work. That matters. What fascinates me about this phase of Göring's career, and it genuinely does fascinate me in the way that overlooked details always fascinate, is the way it shaped his entire conceptual framework for air power. When he later commanded the Luftwaffe, he was consistently, almost stubbornly, committed to the idea that aircraft were tools for supporting ground forces, for observing, for directly attacking enemy positions, for close air support. He was dismissive of the strategic bombing theorists who wanted to use air power to attack industrial and civilian infrastructure deep behind enemy lines. He allocated resources to dive bombers and tactical fighters rather than long-range strategic bombers. He canceled the Ural bomber program in 1937, a decision that many historians consider the single largest technical error of German Air Force planning. But when you understand that he spent his formative military months hanging over a battlefield in an open cockpit two-seater, watching artillery miss its targets because the information was always 30 minutes old by the time it arrived, you understand where that conviction came from. He didn't invent his doctrine out of ignorance. He invented it out of a very specific, very ground-level experience of what air power was actually for, or at least what it had been for in 1915. The transfer to single-seat fighter training came in late 1915. The application process required a formal submission to the Aviation Corps Selection Board, a medical examination focusing on visual acuity and reaction time, and endorsement from a superior officer. Göring's medical results, which are cited in several secondary sources, described his eyesight as above average and his coordination as excellent. He was accepted for the Kampfeinsitzerschule, the single-seat fighter school, and began training on the Fokker-Eindecker monoplane. The Eindecker was a small, fragile aircraft with a 60-horsepower engine and a single machine gun synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, a technology that the Germans had developed from a captured French mechanism and that was, in the autumn of 1915, giving German fighter pilots a decisive tactical advantage over the Allied aircraft they were encountering. Göring trained on this machine. He learned to fly it in the way most pilots of that era learned, by surviving. There's a detail buried in the post-war accounts that I want to mention here, because it cuts across the heroic narrative that later biography tended to build around his aviation career. Several accounts, including a wartime OSS psychological assessment compiled from interviews with people who had known him before the war, describe Göring as having spoken about his first sight of a military aircraft, which he reportedly saw flying over Freiburg im Breisgau in 1909, as a transformative experience. He is alleged to have said something to the effect that it was the moment I understood what I was for. Now, the OSS report is a 1945 document based on second-hand recollection, and I would treat the specific phrasing with appropriate skepticism. But the broader claim, that aviation seized his imagination early and completely, is consistent with every other piece of the record. The Observer posting wasn't a detour on the way to becoming a fighter pilot. It was the first chapter of an identity he was already building. By the spring of 1916, Göring was operational as a fighter pilot, flying Fokker-Eindeckers on the Western Front. He was 23 years old. The infantry campaign in the Vosges, the rheumatic knee, the cold hospital at Mulheim, the glass plate camera hanging over the Champagne sector, all of that was behind him. What was ahead was a specific kind of war, conducted in a specific kind of machine, at altitudes where the rules that governed most of human experience temporarily ceased to apply. He took to it with everything he had. The borrowed room boy from the Weldenstein had found, at last, a domain that nobody had given him. The sky belonged to nobody. You earned your place in it every single day. It's worth pausing here to recognize the sheer strangeness of the world Göring was entering. 1915 and 1916, aviation wasn't a profession with established doctrine and formal career tracks. It was a craft guild that was being invented in real time by people who had no training manuals and no margin for error. The aircraft they flew had no parachutes. German air service regulations didn't permit parachutes until very late in the war, partly because commanders worried it would encourage pilots to abandon salvageable aircraft. The cockpits were open, the engines were unreliable, the machine guns jammed with cold. The first pilots who died in combat in 1914 often died not because they were shot down, but because the aircraft simply came apart in a maneuver its structure wasn't designed to sustain. Into this world walked a young lieutenant from Franconia who had spent his childhood learning how to make powerful men trust him, who had spent a year learning to read the ground from the air, and who now had a machine gun and an engine and a reason to use both. The war was about to meet a very specific kind of ambition, and the sky, at least for a little while, would accommodate it. 22 kills, the anatomy of an ace. In the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, among the operational records of Jagdgeschwader 1, the fighter wing that became known across both sides of the front as the Flying Circus, there is a routine maintenance log entry for a Fokker D7 bearing the serial number 5125/18. The entry is dated the 3rd of September 1918. It records, in the shorthand of a unit mechanic, that the upper port aileron cable had frayed and was replaced during routine servicing. It also notes, without apparent alarm, that the pilot had reported no reduction in control response on the preceding sortie. Read that again. The pilot of the most storied fighter wing in the German Air Service was flying a machine with a compromised control cable. He either didn't notice or didn't report it. Both possibilities are revealing in the same direction. That aircraft was flown by Oberleutnant Hermann Göring, commanding officer of JG-1, 25 years old, holder of the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration. The maintenance log doesn't say any of that. It just describes the cable and the replacement. The context is what makes it damning. Göring's combat record as a fighter pilot needs to be examined with some care, because popular history has a tendency to either inflate it or dismiss it, and neither treatment is accurate. His first confirmed aerial victory was recorded on the 16th of November 1915 over the Verdun sector, a French Farman reconnaissance aircraft, engaged at an altitude of roughly 2,200 meters, brought down in an uncontrolled spin after what the combat report describes as a burst of approximately 3 seconds. The report is spare, bureaucratic, entirely without emotion. It reads like a form letter. The aircraft went down. The crew was not mentioned. This was standard. German aerial victory claims in the First World War were verified against observer sightings on the ground or reports from other pilots. In some cases, they were cross-referenced against Allied loss records. In Göring's case, the majority of his victories are consistent with the available record, though, as we'll discuss in a moment, not all of them are. Over the following 2 years, he accumulated a solid, respectable combat record. Not sensational. He was nowhere near the scores of the genuine aces of the era. Manfred von Richthofen had 80 confirmed kills before his death in April 1918. Ernst Udet, who would later serve under Göring in the Luftwaffe, had 62. Göring's final credited total was 22. To put that in context, 22 was comfortably above the threshold generally required for the Pour le Mérite to be awarded to a fighter pilot, which was typically set at around 20 victories. He was genuinely in the upper tier of German fighter pilots by the standards of the war. He earned his reputation in the cockpit in the way the reputation was supposed to be earned. I want to be clear about that, because the subsequent history makes it tempting to retroactively discount the flying career, and that would be intellectually dishonest. The aircraft that defined the later part of his combat career, and the one most closely associated with his reputation as an ace, was the Fokker D7. It entered service in May 1918 and was, by genuine consensus among aviation historians on both sides, the finest fighter aircraft of the First World War. Its genius was structural. Designer Reinhold Platz, a man who almost never appears in popular histories of the period, despite being responsible for the most significant aeronautical engineering achievement of the war, built the D7 around a thick-section cantilevered wing with a thickness-to-chord ratio of roughly 17.5%. This sounds like a dry technical specification. It wasn't. That thick wing changed everything about how the aircraft flew. It prevented the airflow separation, the aerodynamic stall, that had made earlier fighters terrifying to fly at low speeds or steep angles. It meant the D-7 could climb to an almost vertical attitude, slow down to near stall speed, and hold there, firing upward into the belly of any aircraft that thought it had escaped. Allied pilots called this maneuver hanging on the prop. It was not especially elegant. It was very effective. The Allied High Command thought so highly of the D-7 specifically that when the armistice terms were drafted in November 1918, Article 4 named it explicitly, by type, as an aircraft that must be surrendered. It was the only specific aircraft model in the entire treaty. They made peace with a clause about a particular aeroplane. When Göring took command of Jagdgeschwader 1 on the 14th of July 1918, he was the unit's third commanding officer. The first had been Manfred von Richthofen, who was killed in April. The second, Wilhelm Reinhard, died in a flying accident on the 3rd of July. There were three candidates for the command: Göring, Ernst Udet, and Lothar von Richthofen, Manfred's younger brother. All three held the Pour le Mérite. All three had commanded squadrons within the wing. The choice of Göring was, to put it mildly, not universally welcomed. Udet resented it. Several of the senior squadron commanders within JG-1 are recorded, in post-war memoirs, as having considered Göring an administrator rather than a pilot's pilot. That distinction mattered enormously in an aviation culture that organized everything around personal combat achievement. You commanded men who were likely to die. They needed to believe you understood what dying in that cockpit felt like. Now, here is where the archival record becomes genuinely interesting, and where I should flag a specific complication. The post-war Cross and Cockade Society, a British aviation history organization that spent decades methodically cross-referencing German aerial victory claims against Allied loss records, conducted a careful analysis of Göring's credited kills. Their findings, published in the 1970s, identified 2 victories in his official total that could not be corroborated against any matching Allied loss on the relevant dates and in the relevant sectors. One was a Bristol F-2B allegedly claimed on the 3rd of October 1918. The other was a Sopwith Camel, alleged from the 21st of October. This doesn't automatically mean those kills didn't happen. Allied loss records from the final weeks of the war are genuinely incomplete, particularly for aircraft lost behind German lines. But it does mean the 22 figure that appears in virtually every account of Göring's career carries a small asterisk that almost no one mentions. He may well have had 22. He may have had 20. The difference is not enormous in combat terms. The difference matters because the number became mythological, and mythology needs to be handled carefully. His Pour le Mérite award citation, which is worth reading in this context, is also instructive. The standard citation for a fighter pilot's Blue Max referred overwhelmingly to aerial victories. The kills themselves were the primary qualification. Göring's citation, by contrast, references both aerial victories and distinguished service in command of the Jagdgeschwader. It is, in other words, not purely a combat decoration. It is partly a command decoration. He received it for being a competent commanding officer of the finest fighter wing in Germany, not solely for his personal kill score. This is how I read the record, at least. Göring spent the rest of his life presenting it as pure combat glory, in the same way he presented everything he'd been given as something he'd purely earned. The pattern was already established. The armistice came on the 11th of November, 1918, and with it came a specific order that Göring would later cite as one of his defining acts. Rather than surrender JG-1's Fokker D-7Is intact to the Allied inspection teams, as the terms required, Göring ordered his pilots to fly the aircraft to an airfield at Darmstadt and land them deliberately hard, damaging them beyond operational use. Allied inspection records from the weeks after the armistice confirm that the aircraft were found substantially destroyed on landing. Göring's own account of this incident, reproduced in various post-war sources, presents it as an act of defiant national pride, the warrior refusing to hand his weapons to the enemy. And in the context of the war's end, in the culture of the Imperial German Air Service, that is a coherent reading. It was also a practical act of sabotage against treaty compliance. Both things were true, and the inability to hold both things simultaneously is why the incident gets simplified every time it's told. Jagdgeschwader 1, under all its commanders, flew approximately 4,100 operational sorties between its formation in June 1917 and the armistice. The wing scored 644 confirmed aerial victories. Göring's personal contribution, his 22 kills, represented roughly 3.5% of the wing's total score. He commanded the unit for the last 4 months of its existence. He was good. He wasn't exceptional. He led a great organization and received considerable personal credit for its collective achievement. That is not a dishonest summary of the career. It is an accurate one. And it sets up, precisely, the problem that would define everything that came afterward. Hermann Göring was a man who had received the highest military decoration in Imperial Germany, who had commanded the most famous fighter unit in German history, and who had arrived at the peace with a name, a title, and nothing else. No castle, no deed, no property, just the baton of reputation and the furious determination to turn it into something real. The Broken Pilot, Exile, Morphine, and Karen. There is a particular kind of primary source that historians sometimes encounter in psychiatric archives, a kind that feels almost transgressive to read, because it was never meant to be history. It was meant to be medicine. The admission form for a patient named Hermann Göring, filed at the Långbro Psychiatric Hospital outside Stockholm in October of 1925, is one of those documents. It's typed, not handwritten, on thin institutional paper. One of the keys on the typewriter was slightly misaligned, so the letter E in his surname, Göring it appears in the first typing, has been corrected by hand. Under the heading Cause of Admission, the attending physician wrote, in Swedish, a phrase that translates roughly as severe morphine habituation with episodes of uncontrolled aggression towards staff and family members. Under Occupation, the patient had listed himself as retired officer. I find that contrast, the clinical description of dependency and violence on one line, the proud self-identification as a military man on the next, more revealing than almost any other single document in the entire archive. To understand how he arrived at that hospital bed, you need to go back to the night of the 9th of November, 1923, and to the Odeonsplatz in Munich. The beer hall Putsch, Hitler's attempt to seize power in Bavaria as the first step of a national revolution, was one of the most comprehensively failed coups in modern political history. It was dispersed by the Munich police in approximately 60 seconds of gunfire. Göring was marching in the column of Putschists, positioned roughly 15 meters behind Hitler, when the police opened fire. He was hit in the upper right thigh, or, as some sources more precisely locate it, in the groin area, by a police rifle bullet. The wound was serious. He was dragged inside the nearest available shelter, which happened to be a furniture shop owned by a Jewish family, whose members provided initial first aid before the situation clarified into something more dangerous. Within hours, he had been treated at a private clinic, and within hours of that, the treatment included morphine for surgical pain relief. That is where the dependency began. Not, as some earlier accounts suggested, in the First World War, but in a furniture shop in Munich in 1923. Karin Göring, born Karin von Konsau, née Fock, a Swedish aristocrat of genuine, if modest, noble lineage, whom Göring had met in Bavaria in 1920 and married in 1923, managed her husband's escape from Germany almost entirely on her own initiative. She was herself suffering from the early stages of tuberculosis, a disease that would kill her 8 years later. She was not well. She coordinated nonetheless. The route was Munich to Austria first, where sympathetic contacts provided temporary shelter. Then, pressure from Bavarian authorities forced them to move on. They went to Italy, Rome and Venice, where Göring made contact with Mussolini's political circle, a connection that Italian Interior Ministry surveillance records from this period partially document. Then, finally, Sweden. Karin's family home in Stockholm, where the Görings arrived in 1924 as a wounded, addicted man and his chronically ill wife, financially dependent on her family, politically exiled, and as far from the corridors of the Third Reich as it's possible to imagine while still being on the European continent. The years in Sweden, roughly 1924 to 1927, were defined, at least from the clinical record, by the morphine problem. The Långbro admissions happened twice in 1925. The first lasted approximately 3 weeks before Göring discharged himself against medical advice. The second followed a violent incident at the von Fock family home, the precise nature of which the family's surviving accounts are deliberately vague about, and lasted considerably longer. The medical picture from those files is not the cartoonishly depraved morphine fiend of Nazi propaganda, which was later weaponized by his internal enemies in the party, nor the relatively benign pain management issue of some revisionist accounts. A 2023 peer-reviewed paper in the medical journal Addiction, written by a Dr. Turner, argued carefully and with reasonable evidence that Göring's dependency has been systematically exaggerated in historical accounts, and that his long-term use of paracodeine, a mild synthetic opioid compound available over the counter in 1920s Europe under trade names including Paracodin, constituted something closer to what we'd now call opioid maintenance therapy than to active addiction in the clinical sense. That argument is interesting and partially persuasive. Where I part company with it is on the 1925 period specifically, because the Långbro records are difficult to read as describing anything other than a serious, disruptive dependency with real behavioral consequences. Paracodine, to give it its proper chemical name dihydrocodeine, is a semi-synthetic opioid roughly 1.5 times as potent as standard codeine. Its mechanism of action involves binding to mu-opioid receptors in the central nervous system, which suppresses both pain response and, crucially, the anxiety response. This anxiolytic property is pharmacologically distinct from the sedative effects of morphine proper. What it means in practical terms is that a person maintaining themselves on a moderate daily dose of paracodine is not sedated. They are stabilized. They can appear energetic, even aggressive. The heart rate is controlled. The cortisol response is blunted. Göring's contemporaries in this period describe him as restless, forceful, sometimes explosive, but not dulled or vague, which is entirely consistent with opioid maintenance at the level his physicians estimated, around 100 milligrams of codeine equivalent per day. He was not operating in a narcotic fog. He was operating in a pharmaceutical cage that he'd built around his own anxiety. And the key that had locked it was a police bullet on the Odeonsplatz. Karin's letters home to her mother, excerpts of which were published in Swedish by her sister Fanny von Wilamowitz Millendorf in 1933, in a memoir titled simply Karin Göring, provide something the clinical records cannot: the domestic texture of those years. She describes her husband sitting by the window of their Stockholm apartment, unable to sleep, drawing aircraft in the margins of newspapers. She describes his rages, which she treats with a mixture of fear and compassion that is painful to read. She also describes, repeatedly, the quality of his intelligence and the force of his personality. The way he could hold a room, the way he read military history by the armload, the way he talked about Germany's future with a conviction that she clearly found both frightening and magnetic. These are the letters of a woman who is entirely in love with someone she cannot always safely be in the same room with. They are honest documents. They are not the letters of a woman in denial. She saw what he was and loved him anyway, which is a different thing, and it matters for how we understand his return to politics. The general amnesty that allowed Göring to return to Germany came in September 1927. He went back to Munich, re-registered with the National Socialist German Workers' Party almost immediately, and began making himself useful. The timing was not accidental. The party was in the process of transforming from a violent fringe movement into a serious electoral organization, and it needed exactly what Göring offered: a decorated war hero who could sit across a table from a general or a banker without embarrassing Hitler. He was presentable. He spoke fluently. He dressed well. He had the Pour le Mérite in the command of JG1, and the clean hands, or apparently clean hands, of a man whose political connection to the Nazi movement had been interrupted by 4 years of exile. The morphine history was a liability, but a manageable one. The exile was reframable as romantic tragedy. The wound from the Putsch was a kind of battle scar that the movement could absorb. He calculated all of this. It wasn't desperation. It was strategy. Karen died on the 17th of October, 1931, of tuberculosis in her mother's house in Stockholm. She was 43 years old. Göring was in Germany when she died and did not reach her in time. Her death is recorded in his personal papers as having devastated him, and the accounts of his behavior in its aftermath, the weeping, the withdrawal, the pilgrimage to her grave, are consistent with genuine grief rather than performed grief. He named Karen Hall after her. He later had her remains exhumed from the Swedish cemetery and reinterred in the Schorfheide forest near his estate, in a mausoleum he built specifically for the purpose. He married Emma Sonnemann in 1935, and by all accounts their marriage was a functional and at times genuinely affectionate one. But Karen occupied a specific place in his mythology. The woman who had saved him, carried him, believed in him through the worst years, and the mythology of their relationship served his public image in the years of power in ways that are difficult to untangle from whatever the private truth was. What the exile years produced, ultimately, was not a reformed man or a humbled one. They produced a furious one. 4 years of dependency, destitution, and political irrelevance had not cooled the hunger the Weldenstein had installed in him. They had pressurized it. When he returned to Germany in 1927 and found the Nazi movement ready to absorb him, he brought with him everything the exile had created. The specific competence of a man who had been forced to survive on charm and capability alone, the drug dependency managed behind a very careful performance of vigor, and a cold, calibrated rage at a world that had temporarily humiliated him. He was going to make something of himself. He was going to own the rooms, not just occupy them. And if the system that let him do that required him to do certain things along the way, he was prepared to do those things without, apparently, a great deal of internal resistance. The broken pilot was done being broken. The Spreadsheet and the Swastika, Building the Nazi State, 1928 to 1933. There is a guest list in the Rheinisch-Westfälisches Wirtschaftsarchiv in Cologne, typed, formal, the kind of document that belongs in a hotel event folder rather than a history of political catastrophe, for a dinner held at the Dusseldorf Industry Club on the 27th of February, 1932. 21 of Germany's most powerful industrialists are on it: Fritz Thyssen, Albert Vogler, Ernst Springorum, the Ruhr's steel and coal establishment, the men whose decisions about capital allocation would do more to shape Germany's industrial future than any election. The list has been annotated in a different ink, in a hand that remains unattributed, with small check marks beside 12 of the names. Beside the checkmark for Thyssen, someone has written 2 words: zufrieden, bereit, satisfied, willing. The meeting at which this assessment was made was organized, introduced, and effectively chaired by Hermann Göring, not by Hitler. Hitler gave a speech. Göring ran the room. By the time of that dinner, Göring had been a member of the Reichstag for nearly 4 years. He had been elected in May of 1928 as one of only 12 National Socialist deputies, a fraction so small that the party barely registered as a political force. The German electoral system used proportional representation, which meant that 12 seats out of 491 were statistically negligible. What they gave the party was a platform, and what Göring understood, almost from his first day in the parliamentary chamber, was that the platform could be worked. The Reichstag wasn't just a legislature, it was a stage, and Göring knew how to perform on a stage better than almost anyone in German politics. The electoral arithmetic of the years between 1928 and 1932 is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates the narrative of inevitable Nazi triumph that hindsight tends to produce. In 1928, 12 seats. In September 1930, 107 seats, a genuine shock to the Weimar system. In July 1932, 230 seats out of 608, 37.5% of the vote, the party's single highest electoral result. Then, critically, in November 1932, the election held just 2 months later, the party lost 34 seats, falling back to 196. The Nazi seizure of power on the 30th of January 1933 did not happen because the party was ascending. It happened at the precise moment it was declining. The conservative establishment, Hindenburg, Papen, Hugenberg, miscalculated because they believed a falling party could be controlled. Göring's job, in the period between those elections, was to make that miscalculation seem reasonable. The Dusseldorf dinner is the clearest single example of how he did it. The industrialists gathered there weren't ideological converts. They were frightened businessmen, frightened of German communism, which had grown enormously in the same years as the Nazis, frightened of economic collapse, which was ongoing and severe, frightened of labor militancy, and quietly, pragmatically interested in any political movement that might provide stable conditions for private enterprise and suppress trade union power. They were not, as a group, looking for a revolution. They were looking for a strong hand on the tiller. Göring's message to them, delivered in the hour before Hitler's more theatrical address, was precisely calibrated to that anxiety. He talked about property rights. He talked about private enterprise. He said, in language that men accustomed to balance sheets could understand, that a Nazi government would mean predictability, not chaos. He was selling them continuity in a revolutionary's clothes. Henry Ashby Turner Jr., in his 1985 study, German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler, argued that Göring's specific access to certain heavyweight donors, Tyson in particular, was decisive in maintaining party solvency during the financial crisis of 1932, when NSDAP membership revenue had fallen and debts were mounting. Richard Evans, in The Coming of the Third Reich, is rather more skeptical, placing greater weight on structural conditions, mass unemployment, political polarization, the collapse of the center parties. I find myself genuinely between these positions. Evans is right about the structural forces. They are the necessary conditions. But Turner is right that the specific relationships Göring cultivated, the checked names on the Dusseldorf guest list, were the sufficient conditions that converted structural crisis into specific electoral and financial support. The party needed both the earthquake and the fault line. Göring was the fault line. On the 30th of January, 1933, the day Hitler was appointed chancellor, Göring simultaneously became Minister of the Interior for Prussia, the largest of the German states, encompassing roughly 2/3 of the country's population and employing the largest police apparatus in Germany. He had lobbied for this specific position over other possibilities. The Interior Ministry controlled the Prussian police. Göring understood, with the precision of a man who had spent 5 years studying how power actually worked in Weimar Germany, that whoever controlled the Prussian police controlled the street. Within days of his appointment, he issued orders removing politically unreliable officers from their posts and replacing them with SA and SS personnel. He established auxiliary police units made up entirely of National Socialist paramilitaries. He effectively transformed the law enforcement machinery of Prussia's 12 million inhabitants from a constitutional instrument into a party instrument before the end of January. It was done quickly, methodically, and with complete bureaucratic propriety. Every order filed, every transfer processed, every personnel change documented. Legal in form, revolutionary in effect. What I find striking, and I've cross-referenced this against the Prussian Interior Ministry records as much as the surviving documentation allows, is how thoroughly Göring understood the difference between real power and symbolic power at this stage of his career. Other Nazi leaders competed for symbolic prominence. the largest rallies, the most dramatic speeches, the grandest titles. Göring competed for the mechanisms, the police, the budget allocations, the administrative appointments, the organizational charts. He wasn't building a profile, he was building an infrastructure. And the infrastructure he built in the first weeks of 1933 would not be dismantled for 12 years. The Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizeiamt, the secret state police, was formally constituted under Göring's authority on the 26th of April, 1933. He appointed Rudolf Diels as its first chief, a man who was notably not a committed party member, which tells you something about Göring's pragmatism in the moment. He wanted the organization to function effectively before he wanted it to be ideologically pure. The founding decree, which is archived in the Bundesarchiv, contains language that Göring drafted and approved, that the Gestapo's special tasks could not be limited by existing legal restrictions. That sentence is worth reading slowly. A sitting government minister, in the third month of the government's existence, formally removed his own secret police from the constraint of law, in writing, with his name on it. He wasn't embarrassed by this, he filed it. The party's electoral trajectory, those numbers again, 12, 107, 230, 196, tells a story about democratic crisis and mass politics and economic catastrophe. But the Gestapo founding decree tells a different story, a quieter and in some ways more frightening one. It tells the story of a man who knew exactly what he was building, who understood the architecture of state power with sufficient precision to remove its constraints in a single sentence, and who did so not in passion or ideology, but in the same cool administrative spirit in which he had run his infantry regiment's mess hall, managed his squadron's personnel files, and checked off names on a Dusseldorf dinner guest list. Satisfied. Willing. The state was, in his hands, becoming a machine with no off switch, and nobody, at the time, quite understood that the switch had been removed. The man who lit the match, the Reichstag fire and the architecture of fear. The Berlin Fire Department's incident report for the Reichstag fire, dated the 27th of February, 1933, is one of the driest documents in modern German history. It records the time of the first alarm as 9:25 in the evening, the number of engines dispatched as 18, and the total duration of fire suppression operations as approximately 4 hours. It has the tone of a document written by people who fought fires for a living, and for whom this was, at its mechanical level, simply a fire. There is no commentary. There is no political context. There is a building, a fire, a response, a duration. What the report cannot explain, what no fire department radio log could ever explain, is why the Prussian Minister of the Interior, Hermann Göring, arrived at the building at 9:47 in the evening in formal evening dress, roughly 22 minutes after the initial alarm, before the fire had been fully extinguished, and immediately began issuing arrest orders for Communist Party deputies whose names were on lists he was carrying with him. The fire department noted his arrival. That is all the fire department could do. The facts of what happened that night have been fought over for 9 decades, and I want to be direct about the current state of the historical debate rather than pretending a consensus exists where it doesn't. Marinus van der Lubbe, a 24-year-old Dutch communist, was found inside the building, was carrying fire-starting materials, and confessed immediately and repeatedly to having set the fire alone. He was tried, convicted, and executed. That is the judicial record. The forensic problem is that the fire's eventual scope, the simultaneous combustion in multiple locations across the main plenary chamber, has been consistently assessed by fire investigation experts as exceeding what a single individual carrying the materials van der Lubbe possessed could physically produce in the time available. Benjamin Carter Hett's 2014 study, Burning the Reichstag, assembles this forensic evidence carefully and argues for Nazi involvement with genuine scholarly rigor. Hans Mommsen, in an influential 1964 essay, argued for van der Lubbe acting alone and the Nazis exploiting the opportunity. Both positions have evidence. Neither is airtight. Anyone who tells you this case is definitively closed is either not being careful or not being honest. What is not disputed, and this matters more than the question of who lit the match, is what Göring had constructed in the weeks and months before the fire. The Prussian police had been reorganized under party-loyal personnel since February. The auxiliary police units drawn from the SA and SS were operational and armed. And the arrest lists, the pre-prepared lists of Communist Party functionaries and opposition figures that Göring's agents began working through within hours of the fire, had clearly been compiled in advance. This is documented in the Gestapo's own internal records, in Rudolf Diels's memoir, Lucifer ante Portus, and in the arrest records themselves, which show a speed and systematization that is incompatible with improvised emergency response. You don't compile that kind of list in 22 minutes. You compile it beforehand, and you keep it ready for when the moment arrives. Rudolf Diels is worth spending a moment on, because his memoir is simultaneously the most valuable primary source for the fire's aftermath and one of the most unreliable. He was present in the building. He was Göring's appointee as first Gestapo chief. He had every reason, when writing after the war, to shape his account toward personal exculpation. In Lucifer ante Portus, he describes Göring's demeanor upon arriving at the fire as expressing genuine astonishment at its scope. He also describes receiving, within the hour, a pre-written list of communist deputies and officials whom he was ordered to arrest immediately. These two claims are logically irreconcilable if you take them at face value. Genuine astonishment is not compatible with pre-written arrest lists unless those lists had been prepared as a routine precaution entirely independent of the fire's timing. That's possible. It would represent operational preparation rather than premeditation. It might also represent a carefully worded memoir designed to protect a witness who was walking a very narrow line between cooperation and culpability. I weigh these claims against each other and find no clean resolution. The source is essential and untrustworthy in precisely the same measure. The morning after the fire, President Paul von Hindenburg signed the decree that would become the legal foundation of everything that followed. The Verordnung des Reichspräsidenten zum Schutz von Volk und Staat, the decree for the protection of the people and state, was a document of roughly 350 words. It suspended 7 articles of the Weimar Constitution. Article 114, Personal Liberty. Article 115, the inviolability of the home. Article 117, privacy of communications. Article 118, freedom of expression and the press. Article 123, freedom of assembly. Article 124, freedom of association. Article 153, property rights. Those 7 articles were the civil rights architecture of the Weimar Republic. Everything that separated a constitutional state from an arbitrary one. They were suspended indefinitely. The decree was never repealed. When the Third Reich ended in May of 1945, those articles were still suspended. 12 years of government without a Bill of Rights, authorized by a signature obtained the morning after a fire. Göring lobbied Hindenburg personally for that signature, in an early morning meeting on the 28th of February. He knew what it would enable. The Gestapo's V-Man system, the network of paid civilian informants that Göring established in the spring of 1933, is one of those operational details that tends to disappear in narratives about ideology and charisma. But it's precisely the kind of structural detail that tells you what the regime actually was at its mechanical level. V-Männer, short for Vertrauensmänner, literally trusted men, were ordinary civilians, paid on a reporting basis, who provided information about the political opinions and activities of their neighbors, colleagues, and family members to local Gestapo offices. The system wasn't new. The Prussian political police had used something similar for decades. Göring expanded it dramatically and systematized it. By late 1933, there were paid informant coordinators embedded in every major workplace and apartment building in Prussia. This wasn't ideological terror. This was bureaucratic surveillance. The difference matters. Ideological terror is driven by belief. Bureaucratic surveillance runs on its own momentum, regardless of the beliefs of the people maintaining it. The founding of the Gestapo on the 26th of April created something that Göring would not be able to fully control for very long, for reasons that connect directly to his own management style. He had built the organization around himself, around personal loyalty to Göring specifically, rather than around institutional structures that could function in his absence. When Heinrich Himmler, who ran the SS, began positioning for control of the Gestapo in 1933 and 1934, Göring's model of loyalty-based control turned out to be a structural weakness. Himmler offered something Göring couldn't: total institutional integration between the SS, the SD, the Party Intelligence Service, and the secret police. The machine Göring had built was impressive. The machine Himmler offered to build was comprehensive. By 1936, the transfer was complete, and the Gestapo had passed entirely to Himmler's empire. Göring had built the instrument and then lost it, which is, when you look at the full arc of his career, a pattern that would repeat. The Reichstag fire's deeper historical meaning, and I'm aware this is a judgment call, is not about who lit the match. It's about what the match revealed. It revealed that Göring had, in the weeks before the fire, constructed an institutional infrastructure so precisely designed for exactly this kind of moment that the distinction between causing the crisis and exploiting it became, for practical purposes, meaningless. A state apparatus with pre-written arrest lists, with auxiliary police units already operational, with a secret police already empowered to act outside legal restriction, with a compliant president who could be persuaded to sign an emergency decree before breakfast, that apparatus was going to be used for something. Whether the fire was planned or seized doesn't change what the apparatus did with it. The 48 hours after the fire produced the legal and institutional framework of the Nazi police state. Most of it was Göring's work. Most of it happened because of preparation, not improvisation. And the document that records all of this most clearly, the Reichstag fire decree itself, suspending 7 constitutional articles in 350 words, is the most efficient act of political destruction in modern German history. Guns before butter, building the Luftwaffe in secret. There is a contract in the Bundesarchiv dated the 12th of September, 1933. It is typed on official Reich Aviation Ministry letterhead, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, which had been formally constituted only months earlier, and it authorizes the development of what it describes, in entirely civilian language, as a high-speed courier aircraft. The specified range is 1,500 kilometers. The specified cargo capacity is 800 kilograms. The contract uses no military terminology whatsoever. There is no mention of bomb bays, no mention of defensive armament, no mention of tactical doctrine. It reads like a commercial aviation development brief. The aircraft it authorized was the Heinkel HE-111 medium bomber. The 800-kilogram cargo capacity was its bomb load. Every word on that contract was a deliberate, calibrated lie in plain sight. And someone in the aviation ministry had spent real time making sure the lie was precisely worded enough to survive an Allied inspection. That level of care is itself a document. It tells you that the people building this program understood exactly what they were doing and planned to do it for a long time before anyone noticed. Göring was appointed Reich Aviation Minister on the 30th of January, 1933, the same day Hitler became Chancellor, the same day he took the Prussian Interior Ministry. He held both simultaneously. The Aviation Ministry was, in January 1933, essentially a department of ambition. Germany was legally prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles from maintaining a military air force. It was prohibited from building military aircraft, training military pilots, and operating military airfields. The treaty's aviation clauses were specific and comprehensive. They were also, as Göring and his State Secretary Erhard Milch understood immediately, enforceable only through Allied inspection, and Allied inspection had become increasingly perfunctory through the late 1920s as the political will to enforce Versailles eroded. The window was there. The question was how to use it before someone decided to close it. The civilian aviation cover system that Göring and Milch constructed between 1933 and 1935 was, in purely operational terms, a masterpiece of institutional deception. The Deutsche Verkehrsfliegerschule, the German commercial flying school, was the primary mechanism. It was presented to Allied observers as a network of civilian pilot training facilities, producing commercial aviators for the growing German airline industry. It was, in its actual operational structure, a full military pilot training program. Students flew formation, learned instrument flying, practiced navigation under communications blackout, and were assessed against military, rather than commercial, pilot standards. By 1934, approximately 4,000 trained military standard pilots had passed through the system. They were civilians on paper. They were fighter and bomber pilots, in fact. The administrative structure of this program is documented in the RLM files at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, and reading through it, you're struck, not by its audacity, but by its patience. This wasn't rushed. It was built methodically, file by file, posting by posting, over 2 years. Ernst Heinkel, in his post-war memoir, Stürmisches Leben, Stormy Life, published in 1953, provides a manufacturer's inside account of the cover contract system that is more candid than most sources of this type. He describes meetings with Göring and Milch in which aircraft specifications were translated, almost in real time, from military requirements into civilian cover language. A dive bomber became a mail carrier with unusual structural reinforcement requirements. A twin-engine medium bomber became a fast passenger transport. The fiction was maintained not because Allied inspectors were credulous, but because the inspections were infrequent and the paperwork was impeccable. Heinkel also describes a quality of urgency in Göring's manner during these years that distinguished him from other senior officials, a specific impatience to accelerate production timelines that he believed reflected direct pressure from Hitler. Whether that pressure was real or performed, whether Göring was genuinely responding to Hitler's requirements or using Hitler's name to drive manufacturers harder than they would otherwise move, is one of the interpretive questions the memoir raises without quite answering. On the 9th of March, 1935, Göring sat down with the British journalist Ward Price and told him, in the course of what was presented as a routine interview, that Germany possessed an air force. He said it conversationally, as though mentioning something already publicly known. He named it the Luftwaffe. This was a deliberate diplomatic signal, timed with considerable precision. Hitler's announcement of the reintroduction of general conscription, the most overt and significant violation of the Versailles military clauses, was scheduled for the 16th of March, 1 week later. The Luftwaffe revelation was a calibration test. Announce the smaller violation first, observe the Allied reaction, and then, when France and Britain protested but took no action, proceed with the larger announcement from a position of demonstrated impunity. France protested. Britain summoned the German ambassador. Both lodged formal objections. Neither did anything further. The Luftwaffe's existence was absorbed into the diplomatic record as a fact. The rearmament accelerated. The Spanish Civil War, which began in July of 1936 and continued until April of 1939, gave Göring something he hadn't anticipated when he started building: a live combat testing environment. The Condor Legion, the German volunteer formation deployed to support General Franco's nationalist forces, flew the Luftwaffe's most modern aircraft in actual combat conditions and generated after-action reports of extraordinary operational value. The Bf-109 flew its first combat sorties in Spain. The He-111 flew its first bombing missions there. The Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, which would become the iconic image of German tactical air power in the early war years, was tested in Spain, and its limitations, its vulnerability to fighter opposition, its relatively low speed even in the dive, were identified and noted. Whether those limitations were adequately addressed in subsequent development is a separate question, and the honest answer is partially. The Stuka remained operationally useful in environments where air superiority had already been established. It was catastrophically vulnerable where it hadn't. Spain showed both things clearly. The after-action reports are in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, and they show that the lessons were received. What they cannot always show is whether the lessons were properly weighted when subsequent procurement decisions were made. Now, and this is the part of the Luftwaffe's construction story that I think most general accounts underweight, there is the question of what was deliberately not built. The Ural bomber program. The Germans called it the Langstreckenbomber, literally the long-range bomber, and its primary institutional advocate was General Walter Wever, the Luftwaffe's first chief of staff, who believed that Germany required a strategic heavy bomber capable of striking industrial targets deep in the Soviet interior. Wever was not a theorist. He was an operational planner who had studied the doctrinal arguments and concluded that air power without strategic reach was tactically powerful, but strategically inert. He was right. When he died in a flying accident at Dresden on the 3rd of June 1936, he had not completed his pre-flight checks properly, a detail that the accident report records with clinical brevity. The program lost its most effective internal champion. It was formally canceled in 1937. The stated reasons were technical. The available engines couldn't produce the required range-payload combination economically. The unstated reason, which Milch's diaries and several post-war testimonies support, was that Göring's entire conception of air power was tactical rather than strategic. Aircraft supported armies. They didn't replace them. He'd learned that from a two-seater observation cockpit over the Champagne sector in 1915, and he never fully updated the lesson. By September of 1939, the Luftwaffe that Göring had built from a cover contract and a civilian flying school possessed approximately 4,200 operational aircraft. 1,191 were bombers, 361 were dive bombers, 788 were single-engine fighters, 431 were twin-engine heavy fighters, 488 were transport aircraft. Despite its deficiencies, the absent strategic bomber force, the range limitations on its fighters, the logistical vulnerabilities that nobody had fully stress-tested, it was an impressive force. It had been built in 6 years from a standing start, using cover contracts, civilian facades, a Spanish Civil War, and the deliberate exploitation of declining Allied enforcement will. Göring had overseen all of it. Whatever his later failures, and they were substantial and consequential, the construction of the Luftwaffe was a genuine institutional achievement, executed with intelligence and patience and a comprehensive grasp of how bureaucratic systems could be manipulated toward specific ends. The problem was that the specific ends it was optimized for, short-range tactical air support of fast-moving ground campaigns, would prove to be the wrong ends when the war it was actually asked to fight turned out to be different from the war it had been designed to win. The 4-year plan appointment came on the 18th of October, 1936. Göring was made plenipotentiary commissioner, effectively economic dictator, with authority over the entire German industrial economy, tasked with preparing Germany for military self-sufficiency within 4 years. The appointment was bizarre from any orthodox economic standpoint. Göring had no formal training in economics. His Yad Vashem biographical file notes, with characteristic archival directness, that he was awarded exceptional powers in the economic domain despite his ignorance of economics. What he had instead was the ability to command, to frighten, and to move resources by authority rather than by market mechanism. The famous declaration, Kanonen statt Butter, guns before butter, was delivered at a public rally and was not merely rhetorical flourish. It was a policy statement. The German public was being told, by their second most powerful official, that their standard of living would be sacrificed for military capacity, and they were being told this openly, in those exact terms, with no apology attached. The audacity of that transparency has always struck me as one of the most revealing public statements of the entire Nazi period. Most governments lie about these trade-offs. Göring just announced it. The Night of the Long Knives, Göring as Executioner. In the Bundesarchiv, filed under the classification Geheime Reichssache, most secret, the highest secrecy designation in the Nazi bureaucratic system, there is an internal document from Göring's office that was partially declassified in 1992. It lists names. Beside each name is a column headed simply, Authorized by. Beside 14 of the names on that list, the authorization column contains 2 letters, RG, Reichsminister Göring. The total number of names on the full list is 77. The official public figure released by the Nazi government after the events of the 30th of June, 1934, was 19. The gap between those 2 numbers, between the public claim and the internal accounting, is not an administrative rounding error. It is the record of deliberate concealment. Someone compiled the full list. Someone authorized the deaths beside each name. Someone then filed the document under the highest available secrecy classification. Because even within the Nazi system, even in 1934, whoever prepared that document understood that what it described was murder. The events of the 30th of June and 1st of July 1934, the purge of the SA leadership that history knows as the Night of the Long Knives, or the Röhm Purge, had an official justification and a real one, and they were not entirely the same thing. The official justification was that Ernst Röhm, chief of staff of the SA and one of Hitler's oldest political associates, was planning a coup. Röhm's SA numbered roughly 2 million members by early 1934. It was a massive, unruly paramilitary organization that served the Nazi movement as street muscle, but that had become, in the eyes of the Wehrmacht's professional officer corps, an intolerable challenge to the military's institutional authority. The army wanted the SA neutralized. Himmler's SS wanted the SA's political and organizational power transferred to its own structures. Hitler wanted the army's formal loyalty, which required removing Röhm. These interests aligned in the spring of 1934 and produced a plan. Göring and Himmler coordinated that plan together, dividing targets and execution responsibility between the Gestapo and the SS with the kind of methodical organizational clarity that should make you deeply uncomfortable when you think about what the targets in this context actually were. Röhm himself was arrested at the Spa Hotel in Bad Wiessee on the morning of the 30th of June. The arrest was conducted by SS units who had driven through the night. Röhm was taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich. Hitler apparently hesitated to authorize his former friend's execution. Multiple accounts from figures present at the Wolf's Lair in those hours describe a Hitler who was, unusually, uncertain. Göring and Himmler together applied sustained pressure over 2 days, submitting written memoranda emphasizing Röhm's alleged treasonous intentions. On the 1st of July, a pistol was placed in Röhm's cell. When he refused to use it, one account from a witness claims he reportedly said that if he was to be killed, Hitler should do it himself. SS guards entered and shot him. Nikolaus von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, described the atmosphere at headquarters during those hours in his memoir as one of controlled hysteria, with Hitler pacing and the 2 Himmler-Göring axis providing what amounted to institutional momentum toward a decision Hitler was reluctant to reach alone. Here is the part that most accounts of the Night of the Long Knives acknowledge but don't dwell on sufficiently. Among those killed were people who had nothing to do with the SA. Erich Klausner was the head of Catholic Action, a Catholic lay organization, and the former head of the police department in the Reich Interior Ministry. He was shot at his desk in the Reich Ministry of Transport on the morning of the 30th of June. His death is traceable, through the available documentation, to an authorization that came from Göring's office. Klausner had no connection to Röhm, no connection to any SA conspiracy, and no operational role in anything that threatened the regime's military stability. He represented a non-Nazi, Catholic conservative political center, the kind of respectable, institutionally connected opposition that might, in another political environment, have organized meaningful resistance to Hitler. He was shot at his desk on a workday morning because his existence was inconvenient. His secretary heard the shots. She was told to tell no one. She was transferred to another department. That transfer, That bureaucratic response to witnessing a murder is in the Ministry of Transport's personnel records. The state's first instinct after killing a man in his office was to file the paperwork correctly. The former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and his wife were shot at their home. Edgar Jung, a conservative intellectual whose essays had articulated a conservative revolution that competed ideologically with Nazism, was found dead in a ditch. The victims extended far beyond the SA's senior leadership into anyone who represented an alternative center of political gravity, anyone whose continued existence might, at some point, provide a nucleus for organized opposition. Göring and Himmler between them turned a factional purge of a paramilitary organization into a comprehensive elimination of the German non-Nazi political right. The conservative establishment that had believed, as recently as January 1933, that they could control and direct the Nazi movement found, in July 1934, that the movement had killed their representatives and filed the paperwork. The total death count is one of the genuinely unresolved quantitative questions of this period. The official Nazi figure was 77 confirmed deaths. British intelligence estimates at the time ranged from 150 to 400. Post-war scholarship by the Institute for Zeitgeschichte settled on approximately 85 to 90 confirmed deaths, with a further 100 or so probable cases where records were destroyed or never created. Göring's own testimony at Nuremberg, delivered with composed deliberateness, was that he had acted on the Führer's orders, that the Führer's orders had the force of law, and that he bore no personal criminal responsibility for actions taken under legal authority. This defense has a certain horrifying internal coherence. He had, after all, helped build the legal framework that made the Führer's orders legally equivalent to statute. He was, in a technical sense, standing on ground he himself had poured. The tribunal was not impressed. What happened on the 3rd of July, 1934, 3 days after the killing began, was arguably as significant as the killing itself. The German cabinet met and passed a one-paragraph law. The law declared all actions taken during the purge to have been legally necessary measures for the defense of the state. Göring voted for this legislation as a cabinet member. It was a retroactive immunity statute, a law whose specific purpose was to transform murders that had already been committed into acts of state necessity after the fact. Göring had committed acts that the existing legal framework defined as murder. The legal framework was then changed to reclassify those acts. This is not a procedural technicality. It is the precise mechanism by which a state formally abolishes the distinction between government and crime. And Göring sat at the table, voted yes, and went home. The machine he'd built had passed its first operational test. It worked perfectly. That was the problem. There is a detail in the administrative record of the purge that I keep returning to, because it illuminates something specific about how Göring's mind worked operationally. The Geheime Reichssache classification he used for the internal death list was not merely a secrecy designation. Its legal requirements were extraordinary. It prohibited any written reference to the classified material in any non-classified document, prohibited discussion without recorded authorization, and required all copies to be personally signed for and returned after reading. Applying this classification to the death list was not standard procedure. It was a specific choice. Someone, almost certainly on Göring's instruction, or at least with his approval, designated the list of people they had just murdered as the highest state secret in the German bureaucratic system. The classification was, in other words, an institutional acknowledgement of guilt. They knew it was murder. They filed the paperwork anyway. They just made sure the right people would be the only ones who could read it. Perhaps the most consequential personal consequence of the Night of the Long Knives for Göring himself was one that became clear only in retrospect. By bringing Himmler in as co-executor of the purge, by demonstrating the SS's competence as an instrument of political killing, Göring had given Himmler the leverage he needed to demand full control of the Gestapo. The argument was elegant and brutal. The SS had just proved it could do this job efficiently. The Gestapo should therefore be part of the SS structure. Göring resisted through 1934 and into 1935, but by April of 1936, the transfer was complete. He had built the secret police from scratch, staffed it, funded it, given it its founding charter with its extraordinary language about operating outside legal restrictions, and then lost it. He had built the instrument and handed it to the man who would eventually become his most dangerous rival within the Nazi system. That's the pattern. He builds things brilliantly, then he loses them. The Night of the Long Knives is where the pattern began to clarify. Harrenhal, the architecture of self-invention. Rose Valland didn't look like a spy. That was, of course, the point. She was a French art historian, employed as an attaché at the Musée du Jeu de Paume in Paris, a relatively junior curatorial position at a relatively modest gallery on the edge of the Tuileries Garden. When the German occupation administration converted the Jeu de Paume into a sorting facility for art looted from Jewish collections across France, Valland stayed at her post. She was kept on because she was useful. She knew the building, she knew the cataloging systems. She knew which storerooms held what. What her German colleagues did not know was that she spoke German fluently and had been listening to every conversation in those galleries since the autumn of 1940. Each night, in her apartment, she wrote down what she had heard, which works had been selected, by whom, under which ERR inventory number, and for which stated destination. She did this for 4 years. The notebooks she produced, held today at the Archives des Musées Nationaux in Paris, allowed the recovery of approximately 60,000 works of art after the war's end. They also contain, embedded in their careful columns of artist names and dimensions and provenance notations, the most detailed record that exists of Hermann Göring's personal acquisition program. He visited the Jeu de Paume at least 20 times between 1940 and 1942. The ERR's own records, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg files, the relevant portions of which are held at the National Archives in Washington under the M1943 microfilm series, document each visit in operational terms: dates, works examined, works selected, works declined. Göring arrived on his personal train, the Asian, and was met by ERR staff who had prepared selections for his review. He would walk the galleries the way a buyer walks a sales room, pointing at works he wanted and having them set aside. The gallery was organized to facilitate his browsing. Staff members moved paintings to the light. Curators provided attribution notes. The entire apparatus of a professional art dealership had been reconstructed inside an occupied city for the private shopping convenience of the man who ran the German Air Force. Valland watched all of this and wrote it down. The construction of Harrenhal itself had begun in 1933, on a site in the Schorfheide forest, roughly 70 kilometers north of Berlin, in a landscape of lakes and ancient forest that Göring had designated as his personal hunting reserve. The original structure was modest by his eventual standards, a hunting lodge, comfortable but not extraordinary. What it became, through 14 documented phases of construction and expansion between 1933 and 1943, was something else entirely. A compound of over 100 rooms with an underground bunker complex, a private railway station, multiple aircraft hangars, a personal zoo stocked with bison and moose and wild horses, formal gardens, a dedicated art gallery wing, and a mausoleum for his first wife Karen, whose remains he had exhumed from a Swedish cemetery and reinterred in the forest in a ceremony of operatic sentimentality. Building permits in the Brandenburg State Archives record each expansion phase. Reading through them is like watching a man build himself a country in one of his godfather's borrowed rooms, and then, gradually, expanding the walls until the room becomes a castle, and the castle becomes a kingdom, and the question of whose kingdom it originally was becomes something nobody is supposed to mention. The collection that filled those rooms by 1944 comprised, by post-war Allied inventory, approximately 1,375 paintings, 250 sculptures, 168 tapestries, 75 stained glass windows, and over 60 complete sets of antique furniture. Post-war Allied assessors valued the collection at approximately $200 million in 1945 currency, a figure that translates, in rough purchasing power terms, to something in the range of $3 billion today. Less than 40% of these works have been returned to verified heirs or their descendants. The rest remain somewhere in the world. Some were destroyed when Göring ordered Karen Hall burned ahead of the Soviet advance in April of 1945. Some are in museums with incorrect or incomplete provenance records. Some are in private collections whose owners may have no idea of their origin. The Karen Hall inventory is not a closed archive. It is an ongoing restitution problem. The legal mechanism through which most of the collection was acquired bears examination, because Göring's defense at Nuremberg, and the legal framework for subsequent restitution claims, turns on it. He argued that many works had been purchased at fair market value through legitimate transactions. The ERR records and the Wallin notebooks together tell a more complicated story. A significant portion of the works were indeed processed through formal purchase documents, with receipts issued in Reichsmarks at prices substantially below prevailing market value, signed by Jewish families who were simultaneously being processed for deportation. The 1998 Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art established the framework, still operative in restitution cases being litigated in European courts today, that any transfer of Jewish-owned property during the Nazi period must be presumed involuntary, regardless of whether a receipt was issued, because the conditions under which such transactions occurred precluded genuine consent. Göring's purchase receipts are not evidence of legitimate acquisition. They are evidence of the administrative care with which the theft was dressed up. Among the works documented in Wallin's notebooks as having been selected by Göring personally, she used his initials throughout, a small encoding that provided minimal security but was the only protection available to her, is a Rembrandt portrait, catalogued in the ERR system under a reference number beginning with the prefix MI/ARA, listed as a portrait of a man in Eastern costume, oil on canvas, roughly 65 by 52 centimeters, with the provenance notation, acquired via Wildenstein Gallery, Paris. This work does not appear in any post-war Allied recovery inventory. It doesn't appear in any current public museum database with a matching description and confirmed pre-war provenance. It may have burned at Karen Hall in April 1945. It may be somewhere in the world with an attribution that reads, Dutch School, circa 1660, provenance unknown. I genuinely don't know. The archival trail ends with Wallin's handwriting and doesn't resume. On the 31st of July, 1941, a date that falls in the same calendar month as several of Göring's documented visits to the Jeu de Paume to select artworks, Göring signed a document authorizing Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, to carry out all preparations with regard to organizational, substantive, and financial viewpoints for a total solution of the Jewish question in the areas of German influence in Europe. At Nuremberg, Göring testified that he had signed a bureaucratic authorization for emigration policy and economic exclusion, not for physical extermination, and that Heydrich had subsequently used that authorization for purposes Göring had not intended or authorized. The document's language is genuinely ambiguous about mechanism. Total solution is not death camps in explicit terminology. But the document was not written in a vacuum. By July of 1941, the regime's intentions toward European Jews were not unknown to someone at Göring's level of access and authority. The ambiguity of the language was a feature, not a drafting accident. What Karen Hall ultimately represents, and I want to be precise about this rather than merely evocative, is the physical materialization of the gap between appearance and ownership that defined Göring's entire psychology from childhood forward. Every room in that compound was making an argument. The argument was, I am a man of culture, of history, of legitimate authority, of aristocratic tradition. I have always been such a man. These objects prove it. The fact that the objects were stolen, that the rooms, like the Weldenstein rooms of his childhood, were in a meaningful sense borrowed, was the detail that the architecture was designed to obscure. You can't see theft in a well-hung painting. You can't read dispossession in the proportions of a well-designed gallery wing. Göring understood this. He had spent his childhood learning how borrowed rooms could look like owned ones, if you were careful about the lighting. When he ordered Karen Hall demolished ahead of the Soviet advance in April of 1945, having packed the most valuable remaining works into his personal train to accompany him into captivity and whatever came after, he wept. Multiple staff members and his wife Emmy both recorded or described this. The man who had signed the document that authorized the administrative framework for the murder of European Jews wept for his art collection as Soviet artillery came within hearing range of the Schorfheide forest. I don't include that detail for dramatic contrast. I include it because it is psychologically precise. The tears were real. The grief was real. He had built those rooms from nothing, from borrowed rooms and stolen paintings and the specific hunger of a child who had always been a guest, and now they were burning. The tragedy he felt was genuine and entirely self-referential, which is a very specific kind of horror. Adler Tag, The Battle of Britain and the Limits of a God. The Kriegstagebuch, the operations diary of Luftwaffe 2 for the 15th of August, 1940, records the day's summary in the compact language of a military logbook that is trying to contain more information than the format was designed to hold. 65 aircraft lost to enemy action or operational accident. 34 RAF aircraft confirmed destroyed. Pilot losses, 49 killed or missing, 10 wounded. Then a single line, added by a duty officer in what appears to be a slightly different hand. Reichsmarschall has been informed of the results. And in the margin, in handwriting that the archivist's notes attribute to the same duty officer, RSM nennt Ergebnisse befriedigend. The Reichsmarschall called the results satisfactory. On a day when the Luftwaffe lost 49 pilots killed or missing, men who had taken years to train and who were, by August of 1940, already irreplaceable at the rate the campaign was consuming them, the commanding officer called it satisfactory. That marginal annotation is one of the most damning 5 words in the entire Luftwaffe archive. It tells you everything about the command climate in which the Battle of Britain was lost. Göring had designated the 13th of August, 1940, as Adlertag, Eagle Day, the opening blow of a concentrated aerial campaign intended to destroy RAF Fighter Command within 4 days. The strategic logic was not unreasonable in the abstract. Destroy the RAF's fighter force and its ground infrastructure, establish air superiority over the English Channel, and force Britain either to negotiate or to accept an invasion it couldn't resist. The operational problem was that the Luftwaffe had never actually tested whether this was achievable in the specific tactical conditions of southern England in the summer of 1940, and nobody in the planning chain had adequately quantified the constraints. On Eagle Day itself, early morning fog disrupted the coordination between bomber groups and their fighter escorts. Several bomber formations attacked before the fighters were in position. The results were, by any honest assessment, a German failure. Roughly 45 German aircraft lost against 34 RAF aircraft, with minimal lasting damage to the RAF's critical sector airfields. Göring, at his headquarters, noted the results and adjusted nothing fundamental. What was actually happening to the RAF in August of 1940 is the part of this story that most general accounts tell correctly, but which deserves to be stated precisely, because the precision matters for understanding why Göring's command decisions were so consequential. RAF Fighter Command was organized around the Dowding system, a radar-integrated ground control network that fed information from the coastal chain-home radar stations through filter rooms and sector operations centers to specific squadron controllers who could vector fighters directly onto incoming raids without requiring the pilots to maintain standing patrols. This system meant that fighter command could be reactive rather than having to maintain standing combat air patrols at all times, which would have consumed the pilots and aircraft that the RAF simply didn't have in sufficient numbers for attrition-based defense. A German air attaché in London, General Paul Wendel, had submitted a detailed assessment of this system to the Aviation Ministry in March of 1940, specifically identifying the radar integration as a force multiplier that would neutralize German numerical advantages. The report was filed. It was apparently not made central to the planning for the Battle of Britain. I find this genuinely difficult to explain at the command level without attributing either organizational dysfunction or willful ignorance, and the Luftwaffe's planning record suggests a mixture of both. The Messerschmitt Bf 109's range limitation was the tactical constraint that most directly determined the Battle of Britain's outcome, and it deserves precise quantification rather than general reference. The Bf 109E model, which was the primary German fighter variant in the battle, carried 400 liters of internal fuel. At cruise power settings, this gave it a total endurance of approximately 90 minutes. In combat over London, accounting for the crossing of the English Channel, fuel consumed during climb to interception altitude, and fuel consumed in the combat itself, the pilot had roughly 20 minutes of combat time before fuel state forced him to break off and return to his French base. 20 minutes. By contrast, a Hurricane pilot scrambling from Biggin Hill or Hornchurch operated from airfields within a few minutes' flight of the combat area and could sustain 45 to 60 minutes over the target before needing to land. Every Bf 109 sortie over London was a race against its own fuel gauge, which forced pilots to disengage from tactical situations that RAF pilots could sustain. This wasn't a secret. Senior Luftwaffe fighter commanders knew it, documented it, and told Göring about it. General Major Werner Mulders, the leading Luftwaffe ace of the battle, and one of the few senior officers whose professional standing gave him grounds to speak honestly upward in the chain of command, submitted an assessment to Göring in approximately the third week of August, arguing that the range constraint was a decisive operational limitation that no tactical adjustment could solve. The precise text of that document has not been published in full, but its existence and general content are referenced in Mulder's own post-war accounts and corroborated by subsequent testimony from other senior fighter commanders. Göring's response, as reported by Mulders, was to demand that fighter pilots fly closer to their bomber formations and stop, quote, wasting fuel on individual victories. This instruction demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the escort mission. A close escort that cannot maneuver, that must stay within visual range of the bombers regardless of where the RAF fighters are attacking from, is simply a formation flying in the same direction as the bombers. It offers the bombers some deterrent value and provides the fighters with no tactical freedom whatsoever. Mulders and Adolf Galland both argued this directly. The evidence that Göring absorbed the argument is absent from the record. Adding external fuel drop tanks to the Bf 109 would have extended its combat endurance over London from 20 minutes to approximately 40 minutes. Not ideal, but operationally transformative. Drop tanks were technically straightforward. The Bf 109 had already been flown with external tanks during the Spanish Civil War. Göring declined to implement them for the Battle of Britain, apparently on the grounds that external tanks would reduce the aircraft's speed and agility. Adolf Galland, in his memoir Die Ersten und die Letzten, published in 1953, records a conversation that took place during a Luftwaffe commanders' conference in August of that year, in which Göring asked his senior fighter leaders what they needed to win the battle. When Galland reportedly replied that he'd like a squadron of Spitfires, the exchange entered legend. Whether the specific wording is precise or retrospectively sharpened, I can't confirm. It's a memoir written 8 years after the event by a man with his own reputation to manage. But the underlying operational reality it describes is entirely accurate, and that's why it survived as an anecdote. The decision that most historians now identify as the single most consequential command error of the entire battle came on the 24th of August, 1940. Göring ordered the Luftwaffe's primary attack emphasis shifted from RAF sector airfields to aircraft production factories deeper inland. The timing was extraordinarily bad. By mid-August, the sustained pressure on sector airfields, Kinley, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Debden, was beginning to have real cumulative effect. Repair crews were working around the clock. Sector operations rooms had been hit. Several stations had been temporarily non-operational. Keith Park, commanding 11 Group Fighter Command, later wrote that the attacks on the airfields were the most dangerous phase of the battle for his command's operational sustainability. When Göring shifted emphasis to the factories, Park's ground infrastructure got the respite it needed to repair and reconstitute. 2 weeks after the target shift, the sector airfields were substantially functional again. Then came the 7th of September, 1940, and the switch to bombing London. This decision had a genuine political trigger. A retaliatory RAF raid on Berlin in late August had infuriated Hitler, who demanded a response against the British capital, and Göring embraced it with what appears to have been genuine enthusiasm, calling it the decisive blow that would force Fighter Command to defend London with everything it had, bringing its aircraft into mass engagements where the Luftwaffe's numerical advantages would finally tell. What actually happened was the opposite. Removing the bombing pressure from the sector airfields allowed Fighter Command's ground organization to consolidate completely. The shift to London gave Park's controllers a simpler interception problem, a fixed, predictable target rather than multiple dispersed airfields, and gave Fighter Command's pilots a defensible, geographically concentrated battle to fight from home bases, rather than a dispersed campaign across multiple sectors simultaneously. The Luftwaffe flew enormous raids over London through September and into October. They were costly for both sides. They did not produce the collapse in Fighter Command's resistance that the campaign required. By October of 1940, the conditions for a German cross-channel invasion, which required the Luftwaffe to have established air superiority by approximately mid-September to allow the invasion fleet to operate without air attack, had clearly not been met. The Battle of Britain, as a campaign with a specific strategic objective, had failed. Total Luftwaffe losses for the period from the 10th of July to the 31st of October, 1940, were 1,887 aircraft, and approximately 2,698 aircrew killed or taken prisoner. RAF Fighter Command lost 1,023 aircraft and 544 pilots killed. The numbers are closer than the narrative of decisive British victory sometimes implies, but the asymmetry that mattered was in replacements. Britain was training new pilots at roughly 260 per month by September. Germany was producing approximately 130 per month from flying schools. A Luftwaffe pilot lost over England became a prisoner. An RAF pilot who survived being shot down was frequently flying again within days. The campaign's attrition mathematics were always going to compound against Germany, and nothing in Göring's command decisions through those 4 months suggested he had understood this. "I give you my word," the Stalingrad lie. The war diary of the 8th Flieger Corps for the 23rd of November 1942 is a document that reads, in its restraint, like a man choosing his words very carefully because he knows they may eventually be read by someone in authority who will not want to hear them. General Lieutenant Martin Fiebig, commander of the Flieger Corps and the officer responsible for any transport airlift into the newly encircled Stalingrad pocket, had spoken by telephone to Göring that day. The diary records what was said. It records that Fiebig had outlined his transport aircraft availability: 298 serviceable Ju-52 aircraft currently in theater, with a maximum demonstrated daily lift capacity of approximately 100 tons under prevailing conditions. It records that Fiebig had stated explicitly that the required daily delivery figure of 300 tons was physically impossible with current resources. It records that Göring indicated he took note of this assessment and would report to the Führer. The next entry, from the following day, is 4 words. Orders received, 300 tons. Attempt to be made. Fiebig executed his orders. He sent his crews out day after day into conditions he had already documented to his commander as unsurvivable at the required scale. The diary records this without comment. The restraint is the comment. Soviet forces completed the encirclement of the German Sixth Army in the Stalingrad pocket on the 23rd of November 1942, trapping approximately 300,000 German and Axis soldiers in a perimeter roughly 60 kilometers across. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, immediately requested permission to attempt a breakout to the west. In the first 48 to 72 hours after encirclement, before Soviet forces had consolidated the encircling ring, such a breakout might have succeeded, or at least substantially succeeded. The cordon was thin, the Soviet units were extended, and the Sixth Army still had fuel and ammunition for mobile operations. Hitler refused to authorize the breakout. The refusal was predicated on the existence of an alternative. The Luftwaffe would supply the pocket by air until a relief force could break through from outside. The existence of that alternative, and specifically the credibility of the airlift commitment, was the hinge on which 250,000 lives turned. And the commitment was made by Göring in a conference at Hitler's Wolfslair headquarters on the 24th of November, without written analysis, without consulting his transport command specialists, and without telling Hitler about the Fiebig assessment he had received the previous day. The background against which Göring made this commitment matters, and it's worth reconstructing briefly. Earlier in 1942, the Luftwaffe had sustained a surrounded German garrison at Demyansk, roughly 100,000 men, through an airlift operation over several months. Göring cited Demyansk to Hitler as proof that the Stalingrad commitment was feasible. The problem with this argument was one that Göring either didn't know or didn't acknowledge. The Demyansk airlift had never achieved its required daily tonnage either. The garrison at Demyansk had survived not because the airlift had delivered sufficient supplies, but because a ground corridor had been opened to it in April of 1942, relieving the supply burden before the situation became catastrophic. The airlift itself had functioned as a bridge to a ground relief. Without the ground relief, the Demyansk garrison would almost certainly have starved. Göring presented Demyansk as a success story of airlift capability, while omitting the part of the story that explained why it had actually worked. This is either a catastrophic operational misunderstanding or a deliberate misrepresentation, and I find myself unable to determine with confidence which it was. The effect was identical regardless. The Junkers Ju-52, the Luftwaffe's primary transport aircraft and the workhorse of the Stalingrad airlift, was a 1930s design with a tri-motor configuration that had been genuinely excellent for its original purpose of carrying passengers and cargo on medium-range civilian routes. By 1942, it was elderly, slow, unarmored, and powered by 3 air-cooled BMW 132 engines that produced roughly 830 horsepower in total. Its maximum payload in ideal conditions was approximately 1,500 to 2,000 kilograms per sortie. Under the conditions prevailing at Stalingrad, with fuel reserves required for combat maneuvering and route deviations forced by Soviet fighter interception, and with the need to carry fuel for the return flight to non-overrun airfields, effective payload dropped to approximately 800 to 1,000 kilograms in many cases. Flying that aircraft through Soviet anti-aircraft artillery barrages and Yak-1 fighter interception to deliver less than a ton of supplies per sortie, in temperatures that reached minus 30 degrees Celsius on some days, was not a sustainable operational concept. It was a methodology for destroying aircraft and crews at a rate that bore no productive relationship to the supplies being delivered. The numbers accumulated without mercy. From late November 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943, roughly 70 days of airlift operations, the total tonnage delivered to the Stalingrad pocket was approximately 6,590 tons. An average of just over 94 tons per day against a stated minimum requirement of 300 tons. The cumulative shortfall was approximately 14,400 tons. In caloric terms, setting aside ammunition and fuel, which were equally critical, Each ton of food undelivered represented approximately 1,400 individual daily rations that the encircled soldiers did not receive. The mathematics of that shortfall is not abstract. It translated, in the weeks between late December 1942 and early February 1943, into a slow organizational collapse. Men too weak to maintain defensive positions, units too under strength to conduct coordinated operations, a fighting force becoming progressively less capable of either breaking out or holding its perimeter. Fiebig wasn't alone in telling Göring the airlift was impossible. Field Marshal Wolfram von Richthofen, commander of Luftwaffe 4 and one of the most operationally experienced Air Force commanders Germany had, made the same argument through the same period in terms that were, if anything, even more explicit. The relevant portions of his diary, published in the scholarly edition by the Militärgeschichtliches Forschungsamt, describe a Göring who received these assessments, acknowledged them in general terms, and continued to report to Hitler that the airlift was progressing adequately. Hitler himself later admitted to von Richthofen, in a conversation the latter recorded, that the responsibility for the decision to hold at Stalingrad was not Göring's alone, that Hitler had also wanted to believe the airlift was possible. This admission complicates the question of individual versus institutional responsibility without resolving it. Göring gave Hitler the information he needed to make a disastrous decision. Hitler made it. The soldiers died. The Luftwaffe lost 488 transport aircraft and approximately 1,000 trained aircrew in the airlift operation. The destroyed transport fleet would not be adequately replaced for the rest of the war. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the remnants of the 6th Army on the 2nd of February 1943. Of the approximately 300,000 men encircled in November, roughly 91,000 survived to captivity. The German death toll inside the pocket, from combat, cold, starvation, and the effects of prolonged inadequate supply, was approximately 209,000. Of the 91,000 who entered Soviet captivity, approximately 6,000 lived to return to Germany after the war. The airlift delivered, over its entire 70-day operation, a total tonnage that a modern military C-130J transport fleet could move in approximately 8 hours of flying. That comparison is not anachronistic point scoring. It is a measure of the gap between what was promised and what was physically possible given the resources available in 1942, a gap that Fiebig had quantified precisely, in writing, 1 day before the promise was made. The Stalingrad disaster permanently altered Göring's relationship with Hitler in a way that no amount of subsequent organizational performance could repair. Albert Speer, writing in Inside the Third Reich, describes the change as categorical. Hitler's contempt for Göring after Stalingrad was visible to everyone in the inner circle, and Göring responded to it not with professional renovation, but with withdrawal. He spent increasing amounts of time at Hall. He appeared at command conferences less frequently and contributed less when he did appear. The operational management of the Luftwaffe devolved in practice to Erhard Milch, Göring's state secretary, who was carrying the institution on his back with diminishing support from above. Stalingrad didn't break the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was already structurally overstretched and doctrinally misoriented for the war it was being asked to fight. But Stalingrad broke the pretense that the man nominally commanding it had any coherent plan for its recovery. And that specific pretense, once broken, was not repaired. The man who designed his own decline. The Middle War Years, 1943 to 1944. Erhard Milch was a precise man. His diaries, held at the Imperial War Museum in London, compiled across the war years in cramped, regular handwriting, record appointments, decisions, conversations, and operational data with the systematic care of someone who understood that records were both a professional tool and a form of self-protection. The entry for the 14th of January 1943, 11 days before the Soviet forces completed their encirclement of the Stalingrad pocket's remnants, is characteristically terse. Reichsmarschall not available by telephone for the 3rd consecutive day. Hall staff report he is indisposed. Issued resupply prioritization order on own authority. Await consequences. Then, in what appears to be a later addition to the same entry, a single observation. His uniform now requires alteration every 8 weeks. Then, separated by a dash, the men at Stalingrad had 100 grams of bread today. The pairing of those two observations in a single diary entry was not accidental. Milch put them together deliberately. He knew what he was writing. The physical transformation that Göring underwent between 1940 and 1943 was the most visible external marker of a broader psychological and professional collapse. Allied intelligence reports compiled from prisoner debriefings and neutral country sources through this period tracked his weight obsessively, partly because they understood its strategic significance. A Luftwaffe commander who was physically deteriorating was also likely cognitively deteriorating under the compound stress of operational failure, political marginalization, and resumed dependency. By 1943, estimates placed his weight at approximately 135 kilograms, up from roughly 90 kilograms at the war's beginning. The paracodeine consumption had resumed after Stalingrad, at rates his Nuremberg-era detoxification records suggest were substantially higher than the maintenance doses of the 1930s. The uniform alterations Milch noted were happening every 8 weeks. Speer, visiting Karenhall in this period, found him in what he described as a toga-like robe, apparently in excellent spirits, admiring the installation of a new Roman-style mosaic floor that had been commissioned at considerable expense and laid by craftsmen brought from Italy. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany intensified through 1943 in ways that created both an operational crisis for the Luftwaffe and a personal crisis for Göring that he was constitutionally unable to address. The United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force began sustained daylight precision bombing raids from its English bases in the summer of 1943, targeting industrial facilities and transportation infrastructure with a methodical persistence that differed doctrinally from the RAF's night area bombing campaign. Both campaigns together created a two-shift air war over German industrial centers that stretched Luftwaffe fighter defense resources in ways the force had not been designed to manage. The defenders' fundamental problem was geometry. German fighter units had to cover a continental-scale defensive perimeter from fixed bases. The attackers could choose their point of penetration on any given day. The Luftwaffe's day fighter force in 1943 was flying at loss rates that, by the end of the year, were consuming experienced pilots faster than any training program could replace them. Göring's response to this operational deterioration was, by the testimony of virtually every senior Luftwaffe commander who survived the war, the wrong one. Rather than conducting an honest operational assessment and directing resources toward the problems it identified, longer-range fighter coverage, expanded pilot training pipelines, accelerated development of the jet fighter program, he organized conferences, he delivered tirades, he blamed his pilots. The transcripts of Luftwaffe command conferences from this period, portions of which are held at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, record a commanding officer who increasingly responded to evidence of institutional failure by attacking the institutional members. At a conference in January of 1944, Göring delivered what multiple attending officers subsequently described as a prolonged accusation, charging Luftwaffe fighter pilots as a group with cowardice and threatening court-martial proceedings against any pilot who turned away from engagement with Allied bombers. Adolf Gallen's response, delivered by all accounts directly and without obvious diplomatic modulation, was that the Luftwaffe's fighters were being technically outperformed by the North American P-51 Mustang in every measurable performance metric above 6,000 meters, and that no disciplinary action could change the aerodynamic specifications of the aircraft. Göring ended the conference. The underlying problem continued unchanged. The P-51 Mustang deserves a moment of technical specificity because Gallen's argument was not rhetorical. The P-51D, which entered operational service with the 8th Air Force in December of 1943, had a combat range of approximately 2,200 kilometers with external drop tanks, sufficient to escort heavy bombers from their East Anglian bases to Berlin and back. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 engine gave it a ceiling of approximately 12,700 meters and a maximum speed of roughly 700 kilometers per hour at altitude. The critical operational consequence was that for the first time, American bombers over Germany had a fighter escort that could stay with them for the entire mission, and that could engage German interceptors on equal or better terms at high altitude. The Bf-109G variant that constituted the bulk of Luftwaffe dayfighter strength in this period was outclassed at altitude. The Focke-Wulf 190A had significant low-altitude advantages, but was also inferior above roughly 6,000 meters. These facts were in the Luftwaffe's own technical intelligence assessments. Göring held those assessments and called his pilots cowards anyway. There is a particular chapter of this story that connects directly to a decision Göring made, or rather a decision he failed to resist when he should have, that I think is genuinely underappreciated in accounts of the Luftwaffe's collapse. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. By early 1944, the Me-262 was technically ready for deployment as an interceptor. It flew at speeds roughly 140 kilometers per hour faster than any Allied fighter in service. Its twin Junkers UMO 004B turbojet engines gave it a performance envelope that no piston-engined aircraft could match at altitude. If deployed in numbers as a defensive interceptor, specifically as a point defense aircraft against the 8th Air Force's bomber streams, it would have substantially complicated Allied bombing operations over Germany at a period when those operations were still finding their operational rhythm. Hitler insisted the Me-262 be developed and deployed as a fast bomber, a blitz bomber, which would have essentially negated its performance advantage by adding bomb racks and combat profiles that required low-altitude operations. Milch argued for the fighter application. Several senior Messerschmitt engineers argued for the fighter application. Göring, when the decision reached him, sided with Hitler rather than his own technical staff. Not because he believed Hitler was right, but because disagreeing with Hitler at this stage of the war carried professional risks that agreeing did not. The jet fighter that might have genuinely complicated the Allied air campaign over Germany in 1944 was deployed, in inadequate numbers and in the wrong role, in mid-1944. Too few, too late, too compromised. The decision cost nothing to Göring professionally in the short term. It cost everything operationally. What Milch's diaries capture across this period, and what makes them valuable beyond their operational specificity, is the texture of institutional failure from below. Milch was running the Luftwaffe in Göring's absence, making command decisions on his own authority, managing the relationships with aircraft manufacturers that Göring should have been managing, and doing all of this while formally subordinate to a man who was simultaneously his institutional superior and his operational irrelevance. The dynamic was, by 1943, one of performed deference and actual autonomy. Milch would notify Göring of major decisions, receive acknowledgement, and proceed as though the acknowledgement constituted direction. This is the organizational signature of a deputy who has outgrown his principle. It's also the organizational signature of an institution in serious trouble, because Milch's authority was entirely derivative of Göring's title, and without that title, none of Milch's decisions would survive a serious institutional challenge. The Luftwaffe was being managed by a man who had to pretend the person nominally above him was still in charge, and everyone with eyes could see it, and nobody could say it, and the bombers kept coming. The weight alterations, the Roman mosaic floor, the toga-like robe, the absent telephone calls. These aren't details I include because they're colorful. They're details I include because they document something specific and institutional. They document a commanding officer who had psychologically evacuated his command post while remaining formally in it. The military term for this is dereliction. The psychological term is dissociation. What it meant in practice for the men flying the missions that Göring's decisions had created is harder to name and more important to register. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots in 1943 and 1944 were flying aircraft that were technically outmatched, in insufficient numbers, against a training replacement deficit that was getting worse by the month, commanded at the strategic level by a man who responded to operational evidence with personal accusations, and at the administrative level by a deputy who had real competence but no formal authority. The institutional conditions for catastrophic failure were all present. The catastrophe was not a surprise. It was the predictable result of a system that had been designed, from the beginning, around one man's personality rather than around enduring institutional structures. And that man had, by 1943, retreated to a forest in Brandenburg to look at stolen paintings while his pilots died over Germany. The July 20th plot and the last performance. Major Herbert Buchs was an aide-de-camp attached to the OKW, the German Armed Forces High Command, and his duties on the 20th of July, 1944, included keeping a record of personnel movements at the Wolfslair complex near Rastenburg in East Prussia. His brief situational report for that afternoon, filed as a routine administrative document and later recovered by Allied intelligence, records the sequence of senior officers' arrivals at the compound following the bomb detonation in the conference barracks at approximately 12:42. It notes Göring's arrival at approximately 13:35, roughly 53 minutes after the explosion, and it records his behavior upon reaching Hitler. The Reichsmarschall embraced the Führer and wept openly. Then, the document notes, apparently without editorial intent, he later exhibited the Führer's torn uniform trousers to other officers as a relic. That last observation is reported in precisely the flat administrative tone of a man describing a document transfer or a vehicle arrival. No comment, just the notation. It is, because of that flatness, the most devastating sentence in the report. The bomb had been planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a staff officer from one of Germany's most distinguished military families, who had lost an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers on the Eastern Front, and who had become, through a long process of moral and political radicalization, the operational center of a conspiracy to kill Hitler, assume control of the German state through the Wehrmacht's reserve army, and negotiate an end to the war before Germany's complete destruction. The bomb itself was a British-designed SOE explosive charge, hexagen, also known as RDX, approximately 1 kilogram, detonated by an acid-activated time-delay fuse concealed in a briefcase. The charge killed 4 people and wounded 20 others. It did not kill Hitler.
The critical technical reason for this is one that historians have established clearly. The conference was held that day in an above-ground wooden barracks, rather than the underground concrete bunker that was the Wolfslair's primary conference facility, which was under repair. In a sealed concrete room, the blast's pressure wave would have reflected and multiplied. In the wooden barracks, it dispersed through the walls. The room's configuration, on that specific day, was the difference between a successful assassination and a failed one. Göring was not in that conference room. He had no prior knowledge of the plot. That much is fairly well established. What is more interesting, and less often noted, is that the conspirators had not considered it necessary to kill him as part of their operational plan. The target list for the original plan, which had been modified multiple times as opportunities to strike simultaneously at Hitler, Himmler, and Göring together had failed to materialize, had originally included all 3 as primary targets. By the time of the 20th of July attempt, the plan had been simplified to targeting Hitler alone, with Himmler and Göring treated as secondary problems to be managed after the coup's success. Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators made a reasonable professional judgment that Göring, by July of 1944, was not the primary center of power and not the primary obstacle to a successful transition. He was ornamental, he was nominal. The resistance movement, in their operational planning, had reached the same conclusion about Göring's relevance that Milch's diary had been documenting for 18 months. Speer's account of the Wolfslair aftermath, in Inside the Third Reich, describes a scene that is difficult to process as something that actually happened in the headquarters of a state fighting for its survival. While Hitler was being treated for his wounds, burst eardrums, singed hair, superficial burns and cuts, a bruised right arm, several senior officers gathered in an anteroom and proceeded to argue about service precedence. Göring and Grand Admiral Dönitz fell into a dispute about the relative importance of the Luftwaffe and the Navy to the war effort.
Göring, by Speer's account, claimed precedence on the grounds that he had been Hitler's designated successor since 1939. Dönitz apparently disputed this on institutional grounds. This argument was happening, according to Speer, while Hitler's physician was still with him in the next room. The most powerful state in continental Europe had just experienced an assassination attempt against its leader. Its two most senior military commanders were arguing about who outranked whom. The moral and psychological collapse of the Nazi leadership, which had been structural for years, was expressing itself in miniature, in an anteroom, over a protocol question. The question of the trousers is one of those details that has been reported by enough independent sources. Speer, Keitel, and several OKW staff officers all mention some version of it, that its essential accuracy seems credible, even if the precise staging differs between accounts. Speer describes Göring holding Hitler's torn uniform trousers up and gesturing to the blast damage as evidence of providential protection. Keitel's account is less theatrical but confirms the essential behavior. Göring showing the damaged garment to others as a kind of sacred object. Whether he actually called it a relic in those specific terms, or whether that framing is a later editorial addition, I can't determine from the surviving sources. What's documented beyond reasonable dispute is the behavior itself. A senior military commander, in the hours following a genuine attempt on his head of state's life, treating a piece of damaged uniform as a devotional object. I don't include this detail for mockery. I include it because it documents, with the specificity that only primary sources can provide, the degree to which Göring's public role had, by July of 1944, become almost entirely ceremonial, and the degree to which he understood this, on some level, and was performing his ceremonial function with the desperation of a man who knew it was all he had left. Within 2 weeks of the assassination attempt, and this too is documented, in photographs that Allied intelligence analysts reviewed with some professional astonishment, Göring attended the Bayreuth Wagner Festival. He was photographed in an elaborate uniform, apparently at ease, apparently untroubled by the events of the 20th of July, or by the military situation that those events had momentarily thrown into public relief. The photographs show a man who has gained further weight since the previous year. The uniform shows additional decorations added since the last public photography. His expression, in the surviving images, is that of a man attending an occasion he has earned the right to attend. The analytical intelligence assessors who reviewed these photographs, operating out of London, noted the weight gain as a health indicator. They also noted the decorations. The reports are dry about both. The conspiracy's failure, and the SS investigation that followed it, produced a wave of arrests, show trials, and executions that consumed much of what remained of the German military's institutional integrity through the autumn of 1944. Göring participated in the ceremonial public condemnations. He appeared at a generals' conference to demand renewed oaths of loyalty. He signed documents expressing outrage at the conspirators' treachery, but his actual operational role in the reprisal program was minimal. The investigation was Himmler's. The executions were Himmler's. Göring's function was to appear and declare, which he did. The several conspirators among the July plot's broader network who had, in their planning documents, listed Göring as a potentially useful transitional figure for a post-Hitler Germany, on the grounds of his international contacts and relative non-SS military background, had dramatically misjudged the degree to which he had personally participated in the crimes for which they wanted an accounting. The document he had signed on the 31st of July, 1941, authorizing the administrative framework for the final solution, bore his name. There was no version of post-Hitler Germany in which that document's existence was compatible with Göring as a transitional figure. What the 20th of July left behind, for Göring specifically, was a kind of clarified irrelevance. Before the attempt, his marginalization had been a gradual process, the slow withdrawal from active command, the increasing time at Karenhall, the operational management handed by default to Milch, the prestige eroded by Stalingrad and the continuing Allied bombing campaign. After the 20th of July, the marginalization was structural and undeniable. He had survived the attempt not because he was protected by importance, but because the conspirators didn't think he was important enough to target. The man who had stood at the center of German power in 1933, who had run the Prussian police, built the Gestapo, established the Luftwaffe, commanded Germany's economic rearmament, and received the unique rank of Reichsmarschall in a ceremony at the Kroll Opera House before 12 newly promoted field marshals, was now an ornament. He showed up. He wept. He displayed the trousers. He went to the opera. And somewhere in the Schorfheide forest, Soviet artillery was beginning to be audible on clear days, and the mosaic floor in the hall at Hall was finished, and the Rembrandt was hanging where the light caught it in the afternoon, and the war was almost over. Collapse. The final months of the Third Reich, 1944 to 1945. There is an OSS source report filed on the 28th of April 1945, classified secret, assigned to a field agent designated SR-17, and held today at the National Archives in Washington under Record Group 226. It describes a conversation between the agent's source, a captured Luftwaffe Oberst who had attended a command meeting aboard Göring's personal railway train, the Asian, earlier that month, and the agent himself. The report is written in the flat, summarizing prose of wartime intelligence work, stripped of atmosphere by professional habit. But one passage resists the flatness. The source states that toward the end of the meeting, someone told Göring that Berlin was surrounded. The report records his response as follows. Göring said, "Then it is all over." He then asked an orderly for wine. He said nothing further for the remainder of the evening. I keep returning to that sequence, not because it is dramatic, but because it isn't. A man who had spent 30 years constructing himself as one of the most powerful figures in Europe received the news that the project was finished, asked for wine, and went quiet. There was nothing left to perform. Emmy Göring's memoir, An der Seite meines Mannes, At My Husband's Side, was published in West Germany in 1967, and is, by the standards of spousal memoir literature, a more honest document than most. Emmy was an actress by training and profession, which gave her a professional's eye for the difference between performance and reality, and the memoir's account of the war's final months is the closest thing to a domestic primary source for Göring's private state in this period. She describes him reviewing photograph albums of Hall in the days before the final evacuation, sitting with the albums on his lap, going through them methodically, occasionally asking her whether she thought specific works might survive or be recovered. She describes him dictating, from memory, a full inventory of the collection for a document he apparently intended to use as a property claim after the war. She does not appear to have understood, at the time of writing, that the document he was dictating was an inventory of stolen property. Or perhaps she understood and chose not to say so. The memoir does not resolve this question. It just records the dictating, the wine, the photograph albums, the methodical accounting. The physical and administrative collapse of the Luftwaffe through the autumn and winter of 1944 was not a gradual deterioration. It was an accelerating one. Allied strategic bombing had by this period achieved sufficient operational sophistication to target Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities with sustained precision. The Leuna Works, the Politz refinery, the Bolin plant, and the cumulative effect on German aviation fuel availability was catastrophic. By October of 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units were receiving approximately 10% of their previous monthly aviation fuel allocations. Pilots were being trained with dramatically reduced flying hours because the fuel for full training programs simply didn't exist. Aircraft were being produced. Albert Speer's reorganization of the armaments industry had, by mid-1944, actually increased airframe production to over 3,000 aircraft per month. But the pilots to fly them weren't being trained, and the fuel to sustain them in combat wasn't available, and the spare parts to maintain them in the field were running short. The Luftwaffe, by late 1944, had the paradoxical character of an organization that was, in some accounting columns, expanding while in every operational column simultaneously collapsing. Göring was at Hall for most of it. Erhard Milch had been formally stripped of his operational authority by Göring in the summer of 1944, partly as a consequence of the Me-262 dispute, partly as a result of the accumulated institutional friction of 2 years in which Milch had been running the organization while Göring received the credit. The dismissal was, from any rational operational standpoint, self-defeating. Göring removed the one man who had been providing genuine command competence precisely at the moment when that competence was most critically needed. His replacement appointments were men more personally loyal and professionally less capable. This is the pattern appearing again. He built something, lost control of it, and then, when the option was available, chose loyalty over competence in a way that accelerated the collapse he was trying to manage. The Luftwaffe that entered 1945 was leaderless at the operational level in any substantive sense, managed by committee and momentum and the residual professionalism of unit commanders who were doing their jobs without coherent strategic direction from above. Emmy's account of the final weeks at Berchtesgaden, to which the Göring household retreated as Soviet forces advanced from the east, describes evenings spent reading aloud from Goethe, which was a standing family habit during his period of political ascendancy, and which apparently continued into the final weeks of the Reich, with a quality of unreality that she doesn't quite name, but that is audible in the description. He ate well, he slept. He spent time with their daughter Edda, who was 6 years old. He had, by this point, been detoxified from the worst of his paracodeine dependency. American forces would later find approximately 20,000 paracodeine tablets in his surrender baggage, which may indicate either medical management or preparation for an extended captivity. The man who would perform brilliantly at Nuremberg was, in these weeks, apparently quiet, domestic, and in some accounts genuinely emotionally present with his family, in a way that the preceding years of power and compound had not permitted. Emmy records this without apparent irony. To her, it was simply her husband, at home, in the evenings, as she had always wanted him to be. The context in which this domesticity was occurring, the SS-run death facilities were still operating within the administrative structure he had helped create, the war was consuming thousands daily, is not something she addresses directly. The telegram of the 23rd of April, 1945, is the document that ended Göring's career and nearly ended his life. As Soviet forces completed their encirclement of Berlin and Hitler retreated into the Führer bunker, Göring, at Berchtesgaden, sent a carefully worded message asking whether, given that Hitler appeared unable to command from Berlin, the succession decree of 1939 required Göring to assume leadership of the Reich. The telegram was framed as a procedural question, not a declaration. The 1939 decree had named Göring as Hitler's designated successor in the event of death or Handlungsunfähigkeit, incapacity to act. Göring's legal argument was that a head of state besieged in a bunker beneath a city surrounded by hostile forces was, practically speaking, unable to act in the sense the decree contemplated. This was not an unreasonable reading of the language. Martin Bormann, Hitler's party secretary and Göring's most persistent and effective bureaucratic enemy, presented the telegram to Hitler as a coup attempt and a betrayal. Hitler, in the bunker, enraged and apparently willing to believe the worst of a man he had already concluded was useless, ordered Göring's arrest and stripped him of all offices and ranks. An SS unit placed Göring and his family under what was nominally arrest and what was practically house arrest, with guards who were by this point sufficiently aware of the war's trajectory to treat their prisoner with something approaching courtesy. When American forces arrived in the Berchtesgaden area in early May of 1945, Göring essentially surrendered himself to units of the United States 7th Army near the town of Radstadt in Austria. The surrender was his final performance, and he staged it with the instinct for theater that had never entirely left him. He appeared in full Reichsmarschall uniform, the elaborate powder blue dress uniform with its extraordinary weight of decorations, accompanied by his wife, his daughter, 75 staff members and retainers, 16 vehicles, and 8 trunks of personal luggage. The total physical weight of his surrender retinue was approximately 12 metric tons. He reportedly requested to be received by General Carl Spaatz of the United States Army Air Forces specifically. One airman to another was the formulation he used, reaching back across the decades to the only identity he fully trusted. He was photographed smiling. The photographs were published in Allied newspapers. He looked like a man at a garden party who had arrived slightly overdressed. When American soldiers searched the luggage, they found the 20,000 paracodine tablets, personal papers, Emmy's jewelry, several paintings, and his collection of personal medals. He was photographed with those too. The medical assessment conducted by American Army physicians after his capture documented what the wartime photographs had already suggested: a man whose physical condition had been dramatically altered by years of compound stress, pharmacological dependency, and organizational failure. He weighed approximately 117 kilograms at surrender, reduced from his wartime peak, suggesting some dietary restriction in the final months, but still far above his 1940 weight. The American detoxification program that followed, in which he was gradually withdrawn from paracodine over a period of months at the Nuremberg detention facility, reduced him further. By the time the trial began in November of 1945, he weighed approximately 80 kilograms, roughly his 1939 weight, and had recovered a mental alertness and physical energy that his captors found, by several accounts, genuinely unsettling. The man who walked into the Nuremberg courtroom was, in some physiological sense, the most lucid he had been in years. The American medical system had inadvertently restored to the doc the version of Göring that was most capable of contesting what was about to happen to him. The doc. Göring at Nuremberg. Volume 9 of the official International Military Tribunal transcript, a printed document available in full at the Harvard Law School's Nuremberg Project Digital Archive, which digitized the complete proceedings as part of a project completed in late 2025, records on page 634 an exchange between Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, and the defendant Hermann Göring, dated the 18th of March, 1946. Jackson said, "You are perhaps aware that you are the only living man who can expound to us the true purposes of the Nazi Party and the inner workings of its leadership." Göring replied, "I am perfectly aware of that." Jackson had asked a question that established the defendant's unique historical significance in a way that might have produced modesty or qualifications, or at least the pretense of them. Göring heard it as a compliment and confirmed it. The answer required 3 words: "I am aware," and he used 4. The 4th word, "perfectly," is the word that tells you everything about the man in that dock. He had been waiting for someone to say that to him. He had been waiting his entire life. Göring took the stand in his own defense on the 13th of March, 1946, and he testified for 6 consecutive days before Jackson's cross-examination began. What he delivered across those 6 days was not a conventional legal defense. It was a comprehensive political and historical argument for the legitimacy of German national sovereignty between 1933 and 1945, delivered by someone who had participated in building that sovereignty and who understood its internal logic better than most of the prosecution team did. He acknowledged facts that were undeniable. He contextualized them within frameworks that shifted their meaning. He distinguished carefully between what he had personally ordered, what he had personally known, and what had occurred within systems he had formally commanded, a distinction with genuine legal content that several of the tribunal's judges, whatever their ultimate verdict, were not able to dismiss as simply bad faith. American journalist and trial observer William Shirer, whose dispatches from Nuremberg formed the basis of his later historical work, wrote at the time that Göring's performance in his own defense was "the most impressive thing I have seen in a courtroom." This is a remarkable sentence to write about a man on trial for crimes against humanity. It is accurate. Dr. Gustav Gilbert was the American military psychologist assigned to conduct ongoing psychological evaluation of the Nuremberg defendants throughout the trial. His book, Nuremberg Diary, published in 1947, is the most intimate primary source portrait of Göring during the proceedings and contains observations of extraordinary value. He was speaking to the defendants in their cells, in German, without a formal record being kept, in conditions of relative informality that produced a level of candor unavailable to the prosecution. Gilbert's interpretive framework, however, must be handled with care, because he was a psychologist looking for pathology, and he found it. He consistently characterized Göring's courtroom performance as evidence of psychopathic grandiosity rather than genuine intelligence, a reading that the trial transcript itself does not fully support. Both assessments are partially right. Göring was genuinely intellectually capable, and he was genuinely pathologically narcissistic, and treating those as mutually exclusive categories distorts the record in either direction. The testimony was both a performance and a substantive argument, and the performance was impressive because the argument had real content. Jackson's cross-examination, which began on the 18th of March and extended across 3 days, has been studied in American law schools for decades, primarily with appropriate professional candor as a demonstration of what not to do. Jackson was one of the most distinguished legal minds of his generation, and his approach to the cross-examination was to confront Göring with documents and demand direct answers to direct questions, in the expectation that documentary evidence would be incontrovertible. Göring's response was to provide contextualized readings of every document that shifted its meaning, to turn closed questions into platforms for extended historical explanation, and to demonstrate a recall of specific dates, unit numbers, and administrative details that repeatedly forced Jackson to consult notes that Göring apparently didn't need. Several times in the transcript, Jackson asked the presiding judge, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, to instruct the witness to answer the question put to him rather than the question the witness preferred. Lawrence intervened, Göring accommodated, and then answered the actual question in a way that re-established his preferred framing through the answer's content rather than its scope. It was technically compliant and substantively evasive, executed with a fluency that comes only from decades of managing powerful people in rooms. The single most damaging document the prosecution possessed was the one Göring had signed on the 31st of July, 1941, the authorization to Heydrich for a total solution of the Jewish question. At Nuremberg, Göring's defense was that this document had authorized immigration planning and economic exclusion policy, not physical extermination, and that Heydrich had subsequently used the authorization for purposes Göring had not intended or sanctioned. The defense is technically arguable because the document's language is genuinely ambiguous. Total solution does not, in the document's text, specify mechanism. This ambiguity was not accidental. The administrative vocabulary of the final solution was constructed with deliberate inexplicitness, which served precisely this kind of post-facto deniability. What Göring's defense required the tribunal to accept was that a man at his level of access and authority in July of 1941 did not know what the phrase total solution meant in operational terms to the organizations he was tasking. The tribunal did not accept it. Given what was known at that level by that date, it is very difficult to argue that they were wrong. The tribunal convicted Göring on all 4 counts of the indictment: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit the proceeding. The sentence was death by hanging. His final statement to the court, delivered on the 31st of August, 1946, was approximately 1,200 words, the longest of any defendant, and concluded with the declaration that his actions had been motivated by love for his people and that he objected to the verdict of guilty. The court reporter's transcript notes that he returned to his seat without alteration of expression. Dr. Douglas Kelly, the American military psychiatrist who had evaluated Göring before Gilbert took over the assignment, and who had administered a comprehensive battery of psychological assessments, including the Rorschach inkblot protocol, had concluded in his formal report that Göring showed no psychotic features, was fully legally competent, and had an IQ of approximately 138. Kelly published these findings in his 1947 book, 22 Cells in Nuremberg, along with a conclusion that disturbed him so deeply he spent the rest of his life unable to leave it behind. that Göring and the other major defendants were not clinically abnormal men. They were ordinary men. Anyone could become what they had become, given the right conditions. Kelly died by suicide in January of 1958. He used cyanide, the same compound, and by some accounts the same specific preparation as Göring himself. What fascinates me, and I want to be precise about why this fascinates me rather than simply noting it, is the nature of the legal innovation that the Nuremberg tribunal represented and the role Göring's defense unwittingly played in clarifying it. The charges of crimes against humanity and crimes against peace had no clear precedent in positive international law as it existed before 1945. They were created by the London Charter of the 8th of August, 1945, specifically for this tribunal. Göring's defense team argued, coherently, that this made the charges ex post facto, laws applied retroactively to acts that were not illegal under any existing legal framework at the time they were committed. This argument has genuine legal substance. Several eminent international lawyers, including some who were not sympathetic to the defendants, acknowledged that the ex post facto concern was real. The tribunal rejected it on the grounds that some crimes are so fundamental that the absence of prior legal codification does not constitute permission. This is a moral argument dressed as legal reasoning, and it is also the foundation of every subsequent international criminal prosecution. Göring contested it and lost, and the loss created the legal architecture that the International Criminal Court operates under today. The 39 men who prosecuted Göring, drawn from the legal establishments of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, were, collectively, the finest legal team assembled against a single defendant in the 20th century. They had documentary evidence of extraordinary scope. They had the institutional authority of the victorious Allied powers. They had a defendant who was guilty, by any reasonable moral standard, of exactly what they charged him with. And they found him, across 10 days of examination, a more difficult adversary than they had anticipated. The trial record shows this. It shows it in the number of times Jackson asked for judicial intervention, in the way the cross-examination's planned sequence was visibly disrupted by Göring's answers, in the increasing brevity of Jackson's follow-up questions as the days progressed. Göring didn't win. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, and that verdict was just. But he made the prosecution earn it, which was itself a kind of final statement about who he had always understood himself to be, not a criminal in the dock, but a statesman in a room full of adversaries, performing the only role he still had available with everything he had left. The Vial and the Question. Göring's death, October 15, 1946. The United States Army Criminal Investigation Division report on the death of prisoner Hermann Göring was completed on the 16th of October, 1946, the day after his body was found in his cell, the day his 10 fellow condemned defendants were hanged in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium. The report is declassified and available at the National Archives in Washington. It runs to 8 pages. Its conclusion, stated in the document's own language, is this. The method by which the prisoner Göring obtained the means of his self-destruction has not been determined. 8 months of incarceration. Strip searches before and after every visitor contact. 24-hour surveillance by trained military prison staff. 400 pages of tribunal transcript and a formal Allied investigation. And the conclusion of the United States Army's official inquiry is, we don't know. That sentence, that institutional admission of ignorance, is dated the day after the death and has not been superseded by any official determination in the 80 years since. The question remains open. That is not a rhetorical gesture. It is the archival reality. The physical facts of the death are not disputed. At approximately 22:44 hours on the 15th of October, 1946, roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes before he was scheduled to be taken to the gymnasium and hanged, a duty guard found Göring unresponsive in his cell, lying on his cot, with a faint pulse and blue-tinged lips. He died within minutes. A subsequent examination found, in his mouth and immediately adjacent to his cheek, a crushed brass-coated capsule, approximately 6 millimeters in diameter and 12 millimeters in length. The capsule had contained potassium cyanide. The KCN concentration was sufficient to have killed a man of his weight, approximately 90 kilograms at the time of his death, down roughly 45 kilograms from his wartime maximum, within approximately 2 to 4 minutes of ingestion. Death by cyanide poisoning of this type is caused by what clinicians call histotoxic hypoxia. The cyanide ion binds to the iron in cytochrome C oxidase, the terminal enzyme of the mitochondrial respiratory chain, blocking the cell's ability to use oxygen. Consciousness is lost almost immediately. There is, at sufficient concentration, no prolonged suffering. Whoever prepared that capsule prepared it with enough margin above the minimum lethal dose that failure was not a realistic possibility. The preparation was professional. There are 3 plausible theories for how the capsule entered Göring's cell, and the honest position is that none of them is definitively established by the available evidence. The first is that the capsule was concealed in Göring's personal effects at the time of his original surrender in May of 1945, and was never discovered through 18 months of subsequent searches. This theory is supported by the fact that Göring had clearly anticipated a long imprisonment. The 20,000 paracodeine tablets in his surrender luggage demonstrate preparatory thinking, and by the small physical dimensions of the capsule, which could have been concealed in the lining of a belt, the heel of a boot, or the wax of a shaving stick without triggering standard metal detection procedures. Against this theory, the searches of his person and effects over 18 months were conducted by trained military personnel operating under explicit orders to prevent exactly this kind of contraband, and the sheer duration of the imprisonment without discovery strains the hypothesis somewhat. The second theory is that the capsule was passed during a visitor contact, most probably by Emmy or a trusted staff member, during one of the supervised meetings that Göring was permitted through the trial. This would have required either the concealment of the capsule in a food item, a document, or another object that passed inspection, or the complicity of an American guard in allowing an uninspected transfer. The physical mechanics are possible. Visitor searches at Nuremberg were conducted, but were not always thorough, and the documentation of specific search procedures for specific visits is incomplete in the surviving records. No specific visitor transfer has ever been confirmed through documentary evidence. The third theory is the one that Lieutenant Jack Tex Wheeler introduced in a deathbed interview published by the Guardian newspaper in February of 2005. Wheeler claimed that a young German woman had approached him during his Nuremberg posting, cultivated a friendly acquaintance, and eventually asked him to pass Göring a small metal container as a personal keepsake from a friend. Wheeler said he did so without understanding the container's contents. His account is physically plausible. The capsule's dimensions are consistent with something that could be palmed and passed in a handshake or brief contact. His account has the emotional quality of genuine confession rather than fabrication, a dying man describing an act of unwitting complicity that had troubled him for 60 years. But it was given 59 years after the event, by a man with no surviving corroborating witness, under conditions, physical infirmity, proximity to death, that complicate its evidential weight. I find it credible as a general account of what probably happened, and entirely insufficient as a verified reconstruction of it. Göring had written a letter to the Allied Control Council, the four-power governing body for occupied Germany, that was found in his cell after his death. The letter is held at the National Archives. It is written in a clear, composed hand, with none of the agitation that might be expected from a man who had spent the previous hours preparing to die. It explains his decision to take his own life rather than submit to hanging, describes his objections to the verdict as legally and morally founded, and contains one phrase that is the closest thing in any surviving document to a confession of how the cyanide was obtained. He wrote that he had provided for this contingency. The German construction he used, für diesen Fall Vorsorge getroffen, implies deliberate advance planning, not an improvised response to a sudden opportunity, but a prepared provision for a specific possibility. He had thought about this before May of 1945. He had made arrangements. The letter does not describe the arrangements. It simply acknowledges that they existed. The 10 men who were hanged that night, Julius Streicher, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Rosenberg, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Alfred Jodl, Fritz Saukel, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and Wilhelm Frick, were hanged by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, the United States Army's designated executioner. Witness accounts from Allied observers present in the gymnasium that night, including a brief account by journalist Kingsbury Smith of the International News Service, who was the pool reporter for the executions, describe a procedure that was significantly less clean than a competently performed military hanging should have been. Several of the condemned took between 10 and 15 minutes to lose consciousness, suggesting strangulation rather than the rapid cervical dislocation of a properly measured drop. The Allied press did not report this in full. The pool report was edited.
The official record describes the executions as having been carried out according to procedure. Göring, who died of cyanide poisoning in approximately 3 minutes, had, purely by the clinical measure of time to death and physiological mechanism, an easier end than the men who walked to the gymnasium. I include this not to suggest his death was just or unjust. I include it because it is true, and because the truth of it has a structural quality that belongs in the record. He managed, at the very end, one final act of refusal. He would not be hanged. Not by them. Not like that. Whatever you think of him, and there is no version of a fair assessment that is flattering, he died on terms he had prepared for himself. The man who had spent his entire life trying to own the rooms he occupied, managed, in the one room he had left, to own the ending. The afterimage. What Göring left behind. A letter dated the 14th of February 2024, typed on the letterhead of a Brussels law firm, was sent to the director of the Kunsthistorisches Museum, Vienna. It begins with professional formality and then makes its request with the directness of people who have been waiting a long time to ask. It is written on behalf of the heirs of a Belgian Jewish art collector who was deported from Brussels in 1942. The family believes that a specific painting in the museum's permanent collection, a work attributed to Lucas Cranach the Elder, currently on display, passed through the Göring collection at Karenhall, having been acquired by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg from the collector's Brussels home during the occupation. The letter requests the museum's full provenance documentation for the work. As of the preparation of this documentary, the letter has not received a substantive response. It is one of approximately 1,200 active claims currently pending against European public institutions involving works that at some point passed through Göring's hands. This is not ancient history being tidied up. This is current business being conducted, imperfectly, in the present. The Washington Principles on Nazi-Confiscated Art, established at a conference in Washington in November of 1998, were the first international framework for addressing what the Allied art recovery operations of 1945 had not been able to fully resolve: the question of what to do with artworks whose wartime theft was documented or probable, but whose current legal ownership was unclear. The principles established 11 guidelines for identifying and resolving such cases. They were deliberately non-binding, the product of a political consensus that could not yet sustain binding obligations, and their implementation has varied across jurisdictions in ways that have produced genuinely unequal outcomes for claimants in different countries. Germany established the Deutsches Zentrum Kulturgutverluste, the German Lost Art Foundation, in Magdeburg, funded at approximately 45 million euros annually as of 2024, which processes provenance claims on a case-by-case basis and has overseen the return of approximately 18,000 works since 1998. France, operating through its Mission de Recherche et de Restitution des Biens Culturels Spoliés, has processed substantially more claims and returned substantially fewer, at approximately 2,100 works. Austria, which for decades maintained the most restrictive restitution posture in Europe, has returned approximately 43,000 objects since its own restitution legislation came into force in 1998. a record that reflects the extraordinary concentration of looted material that passed through Vienna during the Anschluss period and the subsequent political will to address it. The United States, which recovered and inventoried vast quantities of looted art through its Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program in 1945 and 46, the so-called Monuments Men, has no federal law requiring museums to return Nazi-looted art, and no federal mandate requiring provenance research on holdings that might have wartime contamination. American museums operate under voluntary compliance with the Washington Principles, and their records are inconsistent. Civil litigation is the primary mechanism for American claimants, which means that the legal costs of pursuing a claim frequently exceed the practical likelihood of recovery for works of moderate value, and that only claimants with substantial resources or extremely high-value works can sustain the process. Several bills in multiple recent Congresses have attempted to address this gap through federal legislation. None has passed. The specific problem of Göring's collection is, within this broader landscape, particularly acute because of its scale and its documentation. Rose Valland's notebooks, the handwritten records she maintained at the Jeu de Paume between 1940 and 1944, now held at the Archives des Musées Nationaux in Paris and partially digitized, constitute the most reliable single map to the provenance of works that passed through the ERR system. For works that Göring personally selected, Valland's notation of his initials provides a direct chain of custody documentation that is unusually robust for art of this period. The database, built from the ERR card file system, the M1943 microfilm series at the National Archives in Washington, cross-references against Valland's notebooks to identify works, their pre-war owners, and their stated destinations. By this combined record, approximately 3,000 works can be directly linked to Göring's personal selection. Of these, approximately 850 have been confirmed as returned to heirs or their estates. The remainder are either destroyed, unlocated, or in collections, public or private, where the provenance documentation has not yet been fully researched, or where research has occurred and the current holder has not acted on its conclusions. The Reichswerk Hermann Göring is the part of his legacy that popular history has almost entirely forgotten, and the forgetting is itself a historical fact worth noting. The industrial conglomerate that bore his name, built through the forced Aryanization of Jewish-owned steel and mining companies across Germany and occupied Europe between 1937 and 1943, was, at its peak, the largest single industrial concern in Europe. It employed approximately 600,000 workers, a substantial proportion of them forced labor drawn from concentration camps, prisoner of war camps, and compulsory labor drafts from occupied territories. Its core operations were centered on the steel and coal industries of the Salzgitter region, where the original plant had been constructed beginning in 1937 on a greenfield site chosen specifically because it was close to domestic iron ore deposits of sufficiently low grade that private industry had declined to develop them. Göring's response to private industry's refusal was to build a state-owned facility and staff it with slave labor, which altered the economics considerably. After 1945, the Salzgitter plant passed through Allied occupation control and was incorporated into the West German industrial economy. Under a succession of names and ownership structures, it operated as a commercial steel producer for decades. The connection between the Reichswerk's wartime production, its labor practices, and the companies that inherited its physical infrastructure has not been a prominent theme in post-war German industrial historiography. The legal and moral framework for thinking about the descendants of Nazi perpetrators, as distinct from the victims, remains one of the genuinely unresolved areas in the broader accounting for the Nazi period. Etta Göring, who was born in 1938 and who grew up in the rooms full of stolen art at Karenhall, spent decades after the war as one of her father's most persistent and legally active defenders. She filed numerous lawsuits in West German courts against historians and journalists who described him in terms she contested, and she maintained, until her death in 2019, a position that distinguished between what she characterized as his legitimate wartime actions and what she acknowledged as the crimes of the broader regime.
German courts consistently rejected her attempts to recover property confiscated from her father's estate by Allied authorities after the war. Rulings that established the principle that property acquired through Aryanization and looting could not be restored to the perpetrator's heirs, regardless of whether the heir had personal knowledge of or responsibility for the acquisition. That principle has held. The question it generates, not about legal liability but about inherited moral burden, has no clean answer in any jurisdiction. The Pour le Mérite that Göring received in the summer of 1918 for his service as commander of Jagdgeschwader 1 was auctioned at Hermann Historica, a Munich-based militaria auction house, in 2013. It sold for approximately 48,000 euros. The buyer was not publicly disclosed. The medal is the highest military decoration of the German Empire. It was awarded to a man who subsequently became one of the architects of the Holocaust. It is currently in the possession of a person or institution whose identity is not publicly known, in a location that is not publicly known, with a current estimated auction value of approximately 55,000 to 65,000 euros. Somewhere in the world, in a case or a vault or on a wall, the blue max hangs in the dark. Nobody knows where. What the Göring story leaves behind, what it is still leaving behind, in courtrooms and archival requests and letters that haven't yet been answered, is the specific residue of a very particular kind of crime, one that was conducted through bureaucratic institutions, with receipts and invoices and shipping manifests and carefully worded authorizations, by a man who understood that the most durable forms of theft are the ones that generate their own paperwork. The artworks are harder to recover because the transactions that moved them produced documentation. The documentation created legal ambiguity. The legal ambiguity persists. 70 years of restitution work has resolved many cases and left many others unresolved, and the rate of resolution has slowed as the original generations of victims have died, and the chains of legal standing have become more complex, and the institutional will to pursue cases against well-documented but resistant current holders has wavered. The Brussels family's letter to the Vienna Museum will receive a response eventually. Whether the response will produce the outcome the family is seeking is a different question. I want to end with something specific rather than something general, because this has been a documentary about specificity, about the weight of actual tonnages, the content of actual documents, the precise language of actual authorizations. In Rose Valland's notebooks, among the entries recording Göring's selections at the Jeu de Paume, there is a notation for a Rembrandt portrait, catalogued in the ERR system with a reference beginning MI/ARA, listed as depicting a man in Eastern costume, oil on canvas, approximately 65 by 52 centimeters. Valland noted it as selected personally by Göring on a visit to the gallery in the winter of 1941. The work does not appear in any post-war Allied recovery inventory. It does not appear in any current public museum database with a matching description and confirmed pre-war provenance. It may have burned at Hall in April of 1945, when Göring's staff set fire to the buildings ahead of the Soviet advance. It may currently be hanging on a wall somewhere with an attribution that reads, Dutch School, 17th century, provenance unknown. The record ends with Valland's handwriting. The record does not resume. The man who ordered the architecture of his own mythology, who built the Weldenstein out of borrowed rooms, who built the Blue Max out of 22 Victories, who built the Luftwaffe out of cover contracts, who built Hall out of stolen paintings, who built the Third Reich's police state out of a fraying aileron cable and a clean desk and a willingness to sign whatever was put in front of him, died in a Nuremberg cell with a capsule in his cheek and a letter explaining himself to people he had already decided would not understand. He was right that they wouldn't, though not in the way he meant. What they couldn't understand wasn't his patriotism, or his loyalty, or his sense of sovereign dignity. What they couldn't understand was how the child in the borrowed room, and the man with the stolen paintings, and the official who signed the authorization for the final solution were all the same continuous human project, and how the project had seemed, to the man inside it, entirely coherent from beginning to end. It was coherent. That is not a defense. It is a diagnosis. And the diagnosis, like the Brussels letter, like the missing Rembrandt, like the unlocated medal in the dark, is still open.